Chapter 379. When the sword sheath was 90% solidified, there was the first unexpected change. The entire sword sheath trembled intensely, as if it was resonating. But in reality, the spirituality of the sword sheath had sensed danger and was fighting for control of the sword sheath. Lu Xiaoyi naturally couldn't give the initiative to it. The best way was to use spirituality to suppress the spirituality, and replace it with a sword spirit. However, this also meant that he would lose a sword spirit that he had nurtured for many years. He couldn't bear to part with it, and neither was the sword spirit. No sword spirit was willing to become a case spirit. They yearned for the feeling of flying, killing enemies and drinking blood. Without hesitation, he patted looting. The heavenly pure sand that had turned into an illusory bow-length slope in his sea of consciousness rushed out of looting and into the sword case. He was more inclined to control the sword case himself. He had refined the heavenly pure sand for many years. He hoped that he could suppress the spirituality of the sword case and merge the two into one. If it didn't work, he would definitely lose a sword spirit. He had no choice. The heavenly pure sand sank into the sword case. It was an illusory object, so it didn't need a sword spirit to push it. It could automatically act according to Lu Xiaoyi's will. This illusory spiritual power rolled and unfolded in the sword case. It had already wrapped the spirituality of the sword case and assimilated it in an instant before spreading it out again. At this stage, it was more daunting than dangerous. The refining of the solid form advanced steadily towards the final form, but the speed also began to slow down. This was the final and most crucial step. Lu Xi, as well as the three sword spirits, were all doing their best. There was no time to rest and take a breather. Lu Xiaoyi didn't expect that the last 10% would consume so much magic power. He could only grit his teeth and endure. Finally, it was the final moment. However, the sword case was still incomplete. It didn't produce a sword cry, as if it was missing a breath. He had a feeling that this sword case needed a flying sword to sacrifice to the case. His choice was to choose between the Big Dipper sword and the Tiger God's sword. He chose the Tiger God. The flying sword entered the case and was immediately refined into nothingness by a powerful force. The sword case produced a sword cry that shook the heavens. At the same time, a newborn sword spirit was born within. It cried helplessly, "Where's my body?" In that instant, Lu Xiaoyi received two benefits: the completion of the sword case, and the sword's cry was proof of life. At the same time, the titanic flying sword had also given birth to a sword spirit. The problem was that the titanic flying sword itself had been reduced to nothingness. In other words, the newly born sword spirit had become a sword spirit that could only exist in the sword sheath and didn't have its own flying sword body. He didn't have time to feel the feeling of the sword sheath being formed. He had to first appease the newly born sword spirit. This was the moment when it was at its weakest. It was just like when a little beast opened its eyes and habitually treated the first creature it saw as its mother. Lu Xiaoyi threw the Big Dipper flying sword in as well. He coaxed Little Four. "How about you use this flying sword first?" The soaring god sword spirit touched it for a moment before moving away in disgust, indicating that it did not like it. She was quite hard to serve. Lu Xiaoyi continued to coax. "How about I find you a blank sword embryo? Start from scratch. Only the cleanest paper can draw the most beautiful paintings." Gu Bei still had one of the three sword embryos that he hadn't used yet. He couldn't care less about that now. He took it out to make up the numbers. This newly born sword spirit didn't have a flying sword body, so it would be very easy for it to collapse. Therefore, he had to hurry. However, the soaring god sword spirit didn't pay any attention to this blank sword. It still had that arrogant look on its face. This made Lu Xiaoyi feel a little helpless. Where was he going to find a flying sword that matched the soaring god sword spirit's nature in such a short time? The soaring god was a flying sword that attacked the mind. Nurturing it was very troublesome. However, this arrogant sword spirit had found a way to exist on its own. It looked at the four seasons, Ju Cheng, and hidden fragrance fighting in the waves. It rushed over with a sword cry and ran onto the Four Seasons flying sword, refusing to leave. This immediately caused great repulsion from the Four Seasons flying sword. The flying sword flipped left and right in the waves, but it couldn't get rid of this burden on its body. This soaring god sword spirit jumped onto the Four Seasons flying sword, then jumped onto the Ju Qing flying sword or hidden fragrance flying sword. It reaped without sowing. This made Lu Xiaoyi unable to help but have a thought. Since it liked to coexist with the other sword spirits on the same flying sword so much, then, could it be that when it attacked, it could also have a spiritual attack attached to its power? This change needed to be slowly studied. But now, a good thing was that the sword spirits were surfing in the sword case. It was no longer like before in his sea of consciousness, where only the sword spirits were surfing. Instead, the sword spirits were surfing together with their flying swords, truly merging the sword spirits and the flying swords together. This provided a solid foundation for the improvement of his flying sword's attack power. One day in the future, when his own cultivation and the level of the flying sword reached a certain level, the flying sword and its sword spirit would completely merge into one, reaching the point where the flying sword would be the sword spirit, and the sword spirit would be the flying sword. The flying sword would be able to completely combine the physical form of the flying sword with the illusory form of the sword spirit. It could be nurtured in a physical form in the sword sheath, or it could exist in an illusory form in the sea of consciousness. However, to reach this step, at the very least, one had to start from Yuanying, which was too far away from the current Lu Xiaoyi. From this, it could be seen that the difference between the external sword and the internal sword was not that great. The problem was that one had to have the ability to reach that step. Following this, it didn't mean that he could get it done once and for all, and he didn't need to practice the sword anymore. But he could indeed use the success of the sword case to save precious time for himself. For example, he could let the four sword spirits lead their flying swords to surf endlessly in the sword box, while he could single-handedly stab the Big Dipper flying sword, the only one without a sword spirit, in order to gain experience in using the sword. It was troublesome to have too many flying swords because you didn't know which one to practice. One of the biggest uses of the Wei Sword Mountain sword case was to make the perfect choice for the cultivator. None of the flying swords should be left idle, and they should be used to the best of their abilities. This time, refining the sword case also gave him an important hint. Killing people was not the main reason for the creation of sword spirits. It might only be a part of it, but the root wasn't here. Then, how did he, an insignificant foreign sword cultivator, a plunderer from a low-level cultivation world, manage to do something that others thought was impossible, but to him, it was as if it was a piece of cake? Since he started cultivating, many strange things had happened to him. Before, his knowledge was limited and he didn't care, but now that his horizons were broadened, he thought more about some things. For example, the chasing luck in his sea of consciousness, what did it mean to him? Don't look at how lifeless it was on the surface. But he might not be able to see through the mysteries within. Another example, when he first entered Xianyuan to choose the sword pills, why did the sword pills avoid him? Was it a coincidence? Or was it inevitable? Such an obvious anomaly, did the old ancestors of Xuanyuan's internal sword really not suspect it at all? He could easily create a sword spirit now. Did it have anything to do with these anomalies? Did the strange treatment he received at the Snow Dome Peak have anything to do with these? Things were a bit complicated. Chapter 380. Lu Xiaoyi had a rare few months of peace and quiet in Weijian Mountain. He had thought that he could stay here for a longer time, but Lan Qing rushed into his simple cave a few days after he finished refining the sword case. This place was not qualified to be called a cave. Little E! The new 5-ring foundation establishment ranking list is out. Guess where you're ranked? Lu Xiaoyi said weakly. I hope I'm not in the top 1,000. That way, I won't have to deal with those endless troubles. That includes all of you. Lan Chen was exultant. 11th! They probably think you haven't fought with the real experts on the ranking list yet, so you're in this position. If you work a little harder, you'll definitely enter the top 10. You defeated 9 3 Pure One's elites with one sword. Hee, I'm afraid only the top 10 can do that. Little E, you've become famous overnight. You're famous! Lu Xue curled his lips. No sponsorship, no advertisement, and I'm still a pauper. Now I even owe Marshal Uncle Yi a favor. I heard he's already eating porridge. All I get is endless trouble and challenges. Lanqing, tell me, if the 1000th person challenges me and I lose, will the rankings be reversed? Will they think I don't live up to my name? Will they kick me out of the ranking list forever if I'm just a person who fishes for fame? Lanqing shook his head. No, they'll only think that either your opponent cheated or you cheated. Lu Xie sighed. With his promise to Guangbei, it was only a matter of time before he entered the ranking list to fulfill Guangbei's wish. He only hoped to fight for the ranking list later when he was in the late or peak foundation establishment stage. After that, he could jump up and either form his gold core or die. It would be easier. Unlike now, he still had to wait for the opportunity to form his gold core from the middle to the peak. At least 100 years would be wasted in the endless drag of fame. It was too annoying. However, Lanqing gave a more pertinent suggestion. Little E, with your current position, it's easier to go up than down. Why don't you kill them so that they won't dare to challenge you again? This is easier than falling out of the ranking list. What he said seemed to make a lot of sense. The second person who came looking for him was Taoist Yin Yi. Little E, you should go back. At this time, it is not suitable for you to stay in Weijian Mountain. Lu Xie was puzzled. Why? Yin Yi smiled bitterly. Weijian Mountain's influence in Irai cannot be compared to Xuanyuan's influence in the western region. This is a fact, although we are not willing to admit it. As far as foundation building cultivators are concerned, in principle, we don't encourage them to cross regions. That's a matter for Jin Dan, not for foundation building cultivators who lack the ability to protect themselves. If you stay here, you will receive countless invitations. We can't refuse because swordsmen aren't afraid of death. But no one was unafraid of death, especially when it came to meaningless risks. If you don't understand this, you won't be able to go far on the road. Among these invitations, some are hostile, some are kind, and some have other intentions. We can't tell them apart at all. Weijian Mountain won't refuse, and as a famous swordsman, you can't refuse either. Thus, there will be countless uncontrollable situations. We can't send people to protect you forever. That's not the way of Weijian Mountain swordsmen, and it shouldn't be your way. So go back. Only in the dome, under the protection of Xianyuan, can you obtain the most important space to grow. Lu Xiaoyu was stuffed into the teleportation formation on the same day and sent back to Xianyuan. Yin Yu was a very competent and dedicated elder. After cultivating for hundreds of years, he was used to the miserable ending of those so-called geniuses who didn't know how to restrain themselves. When a top sect wants to scheme against you, they have countless ways to do it. They have all kinds of unimaginable methods to ensure that there is no trace of the matter and no one can use it against you. This was the difference between an individual and a group. To fight against such a power, it could only be another power, Xianyuan's sword sect. Of course, Yinyi didn't want Weijian Mountain to bear such pressure. In Irai, Weijian Mountain had always been at odds with the 3 Pure Ones. This was something that everyone could see. What they couldn't see was the careful consideration that Weijian Mountain had behind every confrontation. Swordsmen could pretend to be stupid, but they couldn't be brainless. If they didn't understand this, Weijian Mountain wouldn't have lived until now. Lu Xiao came out from the other side and bowed to his martial uncle who operated the teleportation formation. Then, he quietly left Wingguang Peak and went back to his cave residence. His strength had increased, but his mentality hadn't caught up. He thought that if he didn't show off, people would forget about him. How could that be? This time, the person who invited him was Jin Dan from the Sword Chi Rushing Heaven Pavilion. The treatment was obviously different. I am Gu Ming. I am in charge of the management of the elite disciples in the Sword Chi Rushing Heaven Pavilion. From today onwards, everything you do will belong to the rushing heaven pavilion. You don't have to listen to the orders of the other halls. Of course, being polite is one thing, but belonging is another. You have to be mentally prepared. Lu Xiaoyi nodded. This was a transfer of his file. He just didn't know if this transfer would bring more benefits. Or would it bring more disadvantages? Gu Ming had a serious and businesslike attitude. However, Lu Xiaoyi wouldn't judge a person's likes and dislikes based on their appearance. He couldn't think that they were prejudiced just because they didn't smile at him. Yes. But I don't know what's the difference. I don't think I've come into contact with this before, so... A jade scroll floated towards him. The details are all in here. You can go back and take a look. There's glory and benefits, but of course, there's also duty. Here, I am in charge of less than 50 elite Outer Sword disciples. Regardless of whether they are on the list or not, you are now ranked first among them. You are the eldest martial brother. As the eldest martial brother, you have to have the awareness of the eldest martial brother. In the future, if I'm not here, they will have to carry out your orders. Lu Xiaoyi shook his head so hard that it felt like it was flying. He no longer cared about his so-called elegance. No way, no way! How can I be the eldest martial brother? They are all seniors from the Yan and Guang generations, aren't they? Aren't you throwing me into a fire and roasting me? I can't be the eldest martial brother, but I can barely be the youngest martial brother. Actually, why don't you let me go back? This is too much. Gu Ming didn't give him a chance to decline. In Xianyuan, within the same realm, we only compare strength. We don't compare age, seniority, or whether we entered the sect earlier or later. It's been like this for tens of thousands of years. Can it change because of you? There are more than 20,000 Foundation Establishment disciples in the Outer Sword. Among them, there are more than 20 people who can be ranked on the 5-ring ranking. None of them are ranked within the top 100. You are ranked 11th. The difference is huge. If you don't become the eldest martial brother, who will? Lu Xiaoyi cried out in grievance. Martial uncle, this is fake. This is flattery. The 3 pure ones deliberately exaggerated the news and spread it. Don't tell me the sect can't even see through this? Think about it carefully. Let's not talk about the top 100. Even if it's the top 1,000, have I ever defeated a single one? There are no actual battle examples. It's all based on imagination. The purpose of setting it up so high is that someone wants to use it as a ladder. Chapter 381. Gu Ming's expression didn't change. There are lies and there are truths. At the very least, I know that among the Outer Sword disciples on the ranking list, no one can single-handedly defeat 9 3 pure ones elites with a single sword. Enough with the idle talk. The position of eldest senior brother is yours. There's no room for discussion. My Outer Sword branch hasn't obtained such a high ranking in over 1,000 years. How is it fake? If anyone disagrees, let them challenge the 3 pure ones themselves. Let me tell you, it's fine if you say these discouraging words in front of me, but you can't show your cowardice in front of outsiders. Especially in front of those arrogant Inner Sword disciples. You have to hold your ground for me. This isn't just my wish. It's also the wish of the other disciples in the Rising Heaven Pavilion. It's also the wish of the martial uncles. Well, he had become the Outer Sword branch's golden fighter. In the future, when there were conflicts with the Inner Sword branch, there would be a lot of situations where he would be asked to stand up for them. It was really a case of sitting at home, but trouble came from the sky. Who could he find to reason with? Lu Xiaoyi knew he couldn't avoid it. Ever since the battle on Boating Island, the strategy of hiding his strength and biding his time no longer existed. Now, there were only 2 paths in front of him. Let nature take its course? Or just advance triumphantly? Thus, he put forward his conditions. This was also the first time he had been so confident since coming to Xianyuan. He openly expressed his attitude. I'll do my best to fulfill your expectations. I won't be timid. However, I have a condition. Ever since I entered the sect, The missions have been too frequent. I haven't had enough time to improve my cultivation. Cultivation is the foundation of a cultivator. So, I ask that you give me 50 years of quiet time. After 50 years, I'll do whatever you want me to do. If you want me to go east, I won't go west. If you want me to beat a dog, I won't chase a chicken. Gu Ming laughed angrily. 50 years? You really dare to say that? Are you using the dome as a place to retire? Why don't you ask for 100 years? Your cultivation isn't enough. This is the truth. It's not like the sect can't see it. We also know that your mission arrangements are dense. The sect isn't unreasonable. How about this, 20 years? 20 years from now, I want you to assume all the responsibilities of being the eldest senior brother of this generation of Foundation Establishment cultivators. Lu Xiai sighed. He was already very satisfied. Originally, he thought that having 10 years of leisure time was already very good. 20 years, he thought that his cultivation level would be able to rise to another level, right? As long as his cultivation increased, his current strength would increase tremendously. This was inevitable. Gu Ming changed his tone. But the 20 years I said, I won't arrange any missions for you. However, you still have to participate in some of the activities in the sect. You can't find excuses to decline. While you're at it, you should also rein in those junior brothers of yours. They might not necessarily submit to you now. 20 years later, some of the sect's secret missions will be handed over to you to complete. You have to understand that this isn't because the sect is oppressing you. If a jade isn't carved, it won't become useful. If a person isn't tempered, he won't progress. The so-called tempering is absolutely not just traveling around and enjoying yourself to your heart's content. You also need to be responsible and decisive when dealing with matters. There are many people who want this position, but the Soaring Heaven Pavilion won't give it to them. Sure enough, there were some tricks involved, but Lu Xiaoyi was already very satisfied. After all, the fights and entanglements in the sect weren't like those in the outside world. They were only fighting for spirit and face. There was always room to maneuver. Eldest senior brother cigarette, but was so strange. So strange. In Xianyuan, in fact, in almost every sect, there was a saying that the eldest senior brother was in charge. On one hand, it was because the martial uncles above were lazy. On the other hand, they really wanted to train the ability of the disciples below in advance. A snake wouldn't walk without a head, and a bird wouldn't fly without a head. A good leader was very useful to a team. The test was in all aspects of training. Of course, a super large sect like Xianyuan wouldn't only have one eldest senior brother in charge. He would be too busy. Below him, there was still the second senior brother, the third senior brother. In Xianyuan Sword School, there were 7 senior brothers in charge, but the eldest senior brother was the most important. Lu Xiaoyi was forced to do something beyond his ability. He didn't care about it. If he could avoid it, he would avoid it. However, there were some things he couldn't avoid. For example, the invitation from the other 6 swordsmen who had the title of senior brother. Since he was already the leader, he had to meet the brothers below him. The location of the gathering was on a nameless snowy peak. Lu Xiaoyi only got a location. Obviously, his future little brothers wanted to see his real strength now. They wanted to know if he really had the ability to fight off 9 3 Pure One's elites with one sword, or if it was just an exaggeration and a lie. In the world of cultivation, there was always a mixture of truth and falsehood. There was a group of people who specialized in fabricating rumors to cover up the truth. However, in this case, Dafa wasn't wrong. The fight was real, and the victory was real. However, there were some parts of it that people couldn't accept. For example, Lu Xiaoyi only killed the first 2 3 Pure One's cultivators. In fact, they were also the 2 weakest ones. This was the truth. The other 2 admitted defeat? The remaining 5 didn't even show up. Without seeing it with their own eyes, they couldn't really understand the actual situation of the battle. Another example was that none of the 9 3 Pure One's cultivators who showed up were on the ranking list. Although everyone admitted that there were hidden elites in every sect, and they weren't necessarily weak. There was no accurate standard to judge whether the ones who showed up were the elites of the elites, or just ordinary elites. Moreover, in the eyes of the sword cultivators, there was a deep-rooted belief that one had to pull out a mule or a horse to see if one was a mule or a horse. The so-called elites that emerged from within the sect through acting were actually different from those on the leaderboard who relied on their own strength to fight their way up. The Xianyuan swordsmen paid particular attention to actual combat. They were very clear that the same level didn't determine the same ability. There were too many other factors in a battle. Judgment, experience, psychological quality, courage, and the ability to seize opportunities were often more important than how high one's cultivation was or how many types of swordsmanship one knew. Lu Xiaoyi's problem was that he had never really defeated a person on the ranking list. It was really hard for people to believe that he was in such a high position. It wasn't just the external swordsman sect. In fact, many cultivators from other sects also had doubts about this. This was the trouble of being on the ranking list. If you were ranked too low, people would look down on you. If you were ranked too high, people wouldn't be convinced. The ranking list was really not a good thing. He knew that in order to solve this problem, just like what Lan Qing of the Weijian Mountain said, it was impossible to keep a low profile. There was no room for a low profile, unless you looked down on the other mountains. Beat them until they didn't even have the courage to challenge. In this place, words were useless. Flying swords were the real thing. It was useless to form cliques, and when people over with virtue, the 6 of them were standing on a huge rock with a radius of more than 100 feet on the top of the snowy peak. Snow was falling, and the north wind was howling. The clothes of the 6 of them were fluttering, like 6 long swords, standing still in the wind and snow. They had already felt a spiritual opportunity approaching. That must be the so-called eldest senior brother. They had also thought of countless ways to measure the quality of this new eldest senior brother. If he wasn't as good as the rumors said he was, they were afraid that they would laugh. However, this figure didn't come close to them. What came close to them was a sword light. It split the wind and snow apart. The majestic momentum created an obvious path in the wind and snow. Near the path was a light. When they saw it, it was already in front of them. Chapter 382. It was already too late for them to draw their swords to defend themselves. This person's intention was far beyond their expectations. The distance of the sword was also not within their knowledge. If they were to draw their swords to defend themselves, they would not be able to use their swords. They could only suffer in silence. The 6 of them were all experienced swordsmen. From the momentum of the flying sword, they could tell that it was unrivaled. However, there was one thing that was different. That person's spiritual sense was not locked onto them. In other words, this was just a show of strength. The 6 of them quickly got up. Just as they were about to leave the boulder, the sword light slashed horizontally beneath their feet. The sharpness of the sword light caused the boulder to be sliced in half. Because they had lost their footing, and because of the huge impact, the 2 halves of the boulder fell downwards. But who knew that the sword light would turn around and return? The sword light flashed again, and the 2 halves of the boulder were sliced into 4. The sword light disappeared, and at the foot of the snowy peak, the sound of 4 boulders falling to the ground could be heard. The snowstorm continued to rage, as if the killing intent of the sword light had never appeared. Apart from the empty stone pit at the top of the snowy peak, there was still an innocent boulder here. There was no trace of the person. Apart from the howling of the snowstorm, there was nothing else suspicious. Eldest senior brother had come, used his sword to speak to them, and then left. They could not answer this question. They could not connect. There were 3 meanings in this sentence. The sword had a range of 400 zhang, and they were unable to use their swords at this distance. Even third senior brother, who had the longest range, could only reach a range of 300 zhang. The sharpness of the sword that had sliced through the boulder was enough to send chills down their spines. Even second senior brother, who had the strongest swordsmanship among them, could only slice through half of the boulder. It was impossible for him to slice it in half so easily. The sword slashed back. This meant that the person was still able to control the flying sword as he wished from 400 jans away. This kind of control was enough to send one into despair. It meant that even if he wanted to attack you, he could always stay out of your range of attack, causing you to be unable to retaliate. Among the 6 of them, second senior brother, who was previously eldest senior brother, had an awkward expression on his face. He exchanged glances with the other junior brothers, and they had already given up on the thought of challenging eldest senior brother. The 6 of them were all outstanding talents of the 1,000 Elegance Peaks outer swordsmen. Among them, second senior brother was ranked 1st and 2nd, third senior brother was ranked 15th and 15th, and the other 4 were all ranked in the top 300 of the Foundation establishment roll. Among the external swords, this was already a very good ranking. They had climbed up step by step through many years of hardship and struggle, without a trace of luck. It was also because of this that they had serious doubts about the qualifications of the newly promoted eldest senior brother, but it was also reasonable. Monks, especially swordsmen, value real battles the most. There are many Loki swordsmen on the dome. They can do everything they can in sword simulation, but they know that a real battle of life and death is different from sword simulation. However, there was no one in the dome peak who could completely crush them. Today, a senior brother had jumped out and completely shattered their pride. The sword was heavy and far. If he were to torture them from afar, how many swords could they withstand? The distance between monks was controlled. If the distance was within a few hundred feet, then they could use escape techniques, battle tactics, and other methods to make up for it. It would not be impossible for them to reach it in battle. However, if the distance was within a few hundred feet, then it meant that the opponent could practically beat them up continuously, and it would be very difficult to use battle tactics to close in. This was the most troublesome problem for them. Even with their rich experience, they were unable to do anything in such a simple distance. It made them feel melancholy. Perhaps in a different environment, they might have a chance to fight. However, in the space of a duel, there was no way to deal with a long-distance heavy sword. Looks like our eldest senior brother still has some tricks up his sleeve. At least among us, no one dares to say that they can beat him. However, I still doubt his ranking in the 11th place. If he were to fight against a top-notch Dharma cultivator, they have many special methods. Our eldest senior brother's expertise may not be enough. Third senior brother laughed self-deprecatingly. They did not expect that their fellow disciples would not be able to prove that their eldest senior brother did not live up to his name. Instead, they had to rely on those annoying Dharma cultivators to burst this bubble. They had been on the ranking list for a long time and knew the depth of its depths, especially the top 30. Every one of them had their own unique skills. If they were only able to shoot far and kill hard, then in the eyes of the ever-changing top-notch Dharma cultivators, it was a stupid skill. Second senior brother sighed. Uncle Master Gu Ming said that he would only come out to truly take charge of various affairs 20 years later. Right now, he's just a figurehead. Let's carry on as usual. Let's just wait and see what earth-shaking changes will happen 20 years later. Everyone agreed. They could not be blamed for feeling repulsed. This was inevitable due to the length of their lifespans. They were all over 100 years old, and the oldest among them, fifth senior brother, was even over 150 years old. It was indeed difficult for them to accept calling a 60 or 70-year-old eldest senior brother. If a swordsman was dissatisfied, he would settle it with his sword. They knew that they could not do the same as eldest senior brother's sword move, so they were not qualified to challenge him. However, this did not mean that they could not find other opportunities to challenge him in the next 20 years. A figurehead was still a figurehead. One had to take responsibility for it. Lu Xiaoyi obtained rare time to concentrate on cultivation. This time, he placed his main plan on improving his cultivation. Cultivation was like this. It was a process of constantly making up for one's shortcomings. When one first entered the sect, they felt that their state was not stable, so they focused on improving their cultivation. Later on, when their cultivation was stable, they felt that their swordsmanship was not enough. They were afraid that they would be killed when they went out, so they worked hard on their swordsmanship. Now that their swordsmanship had reached a certain level, they looked back and realized that their cultivation was holding them back again, so they started to make up for it again. This situation would continue. When his state was high, there were still many shortcomings to be made up for. Not only cultivation and swordsmanship, but also spirit, understanding of Tao state, mystery exploration, body technique, and so on. When he had made up for all of them, he would probably become an immortal. But how many people could do it? Lu Xiao divided each day into a few parts. The most important part was the Big Dipper scripture. Other than the 2 hours in the morning and the 2 hours in the morning, he also arranged for 2 hours in the spirit gathering formation to force himself to accept spirits. Out of the 24 hours in a day, he had taken away 8 hours. Other than that, he also planned to practice a few more practical skills to make up for the lack of swordsman's skills. Battles were ever-changing, and so were situations. One sword alone could not do everything. Perhaps one day, he would be able to break 10,000 skills with a single sword. However, it was definitely not now. Every day, he would take out 4 hours to practice his swordsmanship in the Nine Palace realm. Not only did he have the Big Dipper flying sword, he also had a newly carved rain flying sword. This was so that he could prepare at least 2 flying swords that could turn into spirits. His choice was very practical. He did not care about those powerful lightning, space, and the 5 elements. The reason why he chose the rain flying sword was because Yin once told him that 7 out of 10 swordsmen's battles would be in the sky, and 2 out of 10 would be in the water. The rest of the special battles would only add up to 1 stop. Therefore, as a swordsman, it was very practical to have a water-type flying sword. Chapter 383. Ling Ruofeng led a group of junior brothers and sisters to a beginner's stage below Thousand Elegance Peak, sweating profusely. Xian Yuan had 20,000 external swords, but the majority of them were always at the beginner's stage. If one were to look at those elite and outstanding disciples, it would seem that their cultivation realm was never a problem, nor was their swordsmanship a problem. As time passed, their cultivation realm increased, and their swordsmanship improved, as if it was a matter of course. But if one were to look at the group as a whole, the cruelty of the cultivation world would truly show itself. Not everyone could easily advance from the early stage of foundation establishment to the middle stage, to the later stage, or even to the peak stage. Not everyone could complete the engraving and refining of a flying sword in a few years, or even dozens of years, and then begin the refining of the next flying sword. For many cultivators, the middle stage was a hurdle, and the later stage was an even bigger hurdle. There were many who could not reach the great circle of foundation establishment. It was the same for swordsmanship. There were many disciples who could not even master a single flying sword after a few decades. This was a common phenomenon in cultivation. There were always people coming in, and there were always people leaving. When you were unable to raise your cultivation realm, and had no talent in swordsmanship, after a few decades of suffering, cultivators would inevitably seek another direction for themselves. My heart is for the Tao, my heart is for the sword, and I will not regret it even in death. After all, such people were rare. Swordsmen had always been a tradition with a very low success rate, and this had never changed. Therefore, the beginner's stage was always the majority, and it was always overcrowded. The Ice Lake stage was one of the most famous beginner's stages. It had a wide view and beautiful scenery, attracting countless swordsmen. It was also the most popular place for beginner disciples to train their swordsmanship, and it was hard to find a single one. A total of 20 battle arenas were lined up in a row. The winner would stay and the loser would leave. There were many cultivators. Often, after being defeated in a battle, they would have to line up for another 2 hours before they could get the chance to fight again. Waiting was torturous, but there were also some who did not have to wait long. For example, there were 2 stages in the east, where 10 swordsmen were gathered around. They were either fighting one-on-one, or in pairs, and were having a great time. A cultivator said with dissatisfaction. So the stage can be reserved? How come I didn't know there was such a rule? A cultivator beside him said with disdain. There's no such thing as reserved. It's just that he has a powerful backer behind him that we can't afford to offend. The cultivator straightened his neck. Thigh. We swordsmen compete to see whose sword is faster, whose sword is more vicious, and who has more tricks up their sleeves. I've never heard of a competition of thighs. I also know a few martial brothers who have elders in high positions in Xianyuan, but I don't see them being spoiled and arrogant. How thick was this thigh? So crude that many people are afraid of it? A cultivator in the know laughed. His legs aren't that thick. He's just a foundation establishment cultivator like us, but his legs are formidable because they're in the right place. There are over 10,000 disciples under the Thousand Elegance Peak. Regardless of whether it is missions, arrangements, rewards, punishments, or excursions, the Thousand Elegance Peak has a say in everything. From a certain perspective, the Thousand Elegance Peak is even more in control than the various halls. Tell me, if you offended such an existence while you were at the bottom of the Thousand Elegance Peak, would you accept it or not? Seeing that the cultivator was still in a daze, the person in the know sighed. The Foundation Establishment eldest senior brother of Thousand Grace Peak. He's ranked 11th on the list of 5-ring Foundation Establishment cultivators. In the past several thousand years, he's the expert closest to the top 10 of our Xuanyuan's external sword lineage. Tell me, who would dare ignore his legs? Who could ignore it? You have to know that eldest senior brother has only been in the sect for 30 years. He had already reached this stage. If he were to enter the sect for 100 years, oh no, after 100 years, he might not even be in the Foundation Establishment realm anymore. In just another 30 years, he would definitely have a place in the top 10. Do you think you can offend such a character just because you want to? This insider was a person who only believed in the rankings. He was proud of the glory of his family's external sword, but he would not investigate how the rankings came about, and whether it was justified or not. However, there were also those who were more serious, or perhaps those who were jealous, who immediately stood up to refute. 11 is the ranking board's own words. Let's not talk about whether or not he has fought with the top 10 experts. Even if he has fought with those after that, have any of you heard of his battle record? I personally think that the 99% in the upper realm is still reliable, but to jump up 1,000 ranks in just 3 years doesn't conform to the laws of cultivation. Right now, this ranking is ridiculous and has no basis at all. I, Xianyuan, raised my cultivation through battle and am not afraid of challenges. This is something that can be won with strength, so why would I use unorthodox methods? Does Xianyuan lack such a ranking? Thus, whether or not he is eldest senior brother still needs time to prove. I don't think so. When his bubble in the sect is exposed, it will be the moment he loses face on the ranking board. Right now, these people are so complacent that they think they are eldest senior brother's fellow cultivators. It won't be long before they spit out all the advantages they have gained. The higher they stand, the harder they fall. They will become the laughingstock of Thousand Elegance Peak. Originally, it was about the distribution of the sword battle arena, but in the end, it was about whether or not eldest senior brother was justified. However, the latter question was obviously more attractive. Many cultivators who were waiting for the sword battle arena to battle gathered around. How could the person who knew the truth from before be willing to take this lying down? There's no use in talking about this. The ranking board has been able to establish its reputation in the 5th ring for tens of thousands of years. It has grown bigger and bigger because of its accuracy, not because of blind guesses. Regardless of whether it was the previous 9, or the current 11, there is a reason behind it. Let me ask you one thing. If 10 of you, Hai Huzi, were tied together, would you dare to say that you killed the 9 elite cultivators of the 3 pure ones until they didn't dare to show their faces? Are you looking for evidence? You have to have the qualifications first. If you don't know, then it doesn't count? Say that again. When you become a nascent soul or a monarch. With your current conduct, is there anything in the fifth ring that requires you to nod your head to prove? Unorthodox methods? What right do you have to say that? Just because you didn't see it with your own eyes? Feeling the urge to insult others, the insider began to shoot his mouth off. It's normal for people to have doubts. However, it's not our turn. Which of those senior brothers in front of us is willing to have someone ride on their heads? Why haven't they said anything in the past half a year? They didn't even challenge the sword battle arena? Or do they know that it's useless to try? What do you mean by Xianyuan lacks a ranking? Go and look at Xuanyuan's history. Xianyuan has many such honors. Because they have the inner sword. Do we have the outer sword? If not for eldest senior brother standing up for us this time, the outer sword wouldn't even be in the top 100. Yet you still want to vent your energy and weaken yourself here. The reason the outer sword is so weak is because there are too many people like you. Many people think that the outer sword is the inner sword's follower. When the inner sword has a strong opponent, they applaud and think that it's right and proper. When they have a strong opponent, they feel discouraged and pick on them in every possible way. Don't be an outer sword. Just be a concubine. How could Haihuzi stand this person's sarcasm? In an instant they were in a mess. There were also countless people who used underhanded methods, black fists, and tripping. Fortunately, no one dared to use their inner sword. Chapter 384. Similar disputes could be found everywhere in the External Sword Foundation establishment group. Ever since the appearance of the new generation's big senior brother, doubt and support had been the eternal melody. It had never subsided. Without a doubt, the group of cultivators who were mainly foreign cultivators were the ones who supported the External Sword Foundation. Their own camp had produced a powerful figure, so they had to support it. As for the doubts, since the ranking board had acknowledged it, there was no need to compare. The main ones who were suspicious were the local cultivators of the Fifth Ring Mountain. They could not accept the fact that outsiders were stronger than them. On the other hand, the cultivators from Xuanyuan's hometown, Qin Kong, were mostly neutral. They did not flatter or discredit the outsiders. They only cultivated proudly, regardless of the changes in the world. Senior sister, get one! It's very beneficial to flying swords. It's much better than Xuanyuan's. There was a huge commotion outside, but Lu Xiaoyi turned a deaf ear to it. He showed senior sister Yan Qing the sword case he got from Weijian Mountain. Yan Chang was very envious, but she knew that she did not have a chance. In terms of strength, there were countless swordsmen in Xianyuan who were stronger than her. She could not achieve as much as Lu Xiaoyi. Furthermore, she did not have a chance to go to Arai. It was not her turn. We swordsmen are not attached to objects. Lu Xiaoyi interrupted her. Okay. Senior sister, let's not talk about these principles in private, okay? What is an object? Is a flying sword not an object? Is a sword pill not? Why do you have to be so stubborn? As long as senior sister calls me big senior brother, when I come out of seclusion, I will definitely bring you to Arai. I have a relationship with a foolish martial uncle from Weijian Mountain. Yan Chan looked at him seriously. Junior brother, you want to be senior brother? That's impossible. Lu Xiaoyi laughed. He did not have the addiction of big senior brother, but the more senior sister resisted, the more excited he became. With a shake of his body, he had transformed from a little hen into a golden phoenix. Only his two friends in Xianyuan were not surprised. All kinds of miraculous things about this kid had shown signs as early as 5 years ago in the Wolf Ridge. Now that the young eagle had spread its wings, nothing could stop him. Yan Bo didn't come to see him. He was still putting on airs as a senior brother. He didn't know if the power of an external sword big brother was useful in front of an internal sword. It probably wasn't useful. Yan Bo was hurt. He had a premonition that he couldn't beat this former junior brother, so he might as well not see him. Smokey didn't care. She didn't have Yan Bo's inexplicable self-esteem. She always treated Lu Xiaoyi as her junior brother, no matter how strong he was now. Is there anything you need to do outside? You're too big of a target now. There will be a lot of trouble outside. If there's anything you need to deal with, Yen Bo and I can go on a trip for you. Anyway, we're basically running around outside and rarely have time to stop. Yen Bo and Smoky Chang were close to the great circle of Foundation establishment, so for their current situation, cultivation wasn't important. What was important was that they could achieve a breakthrough in their temperament through experience, and some kind of key opportunity. There were Foundation establishment pills for Foundation establishment, but there were no Jean Dan pills for Jean Dan. There were many mysterious variables and there were no rules to follow. Lu Xiaoyi pretended to ponder. I have a second uncle. I haven't seen him for decades. I don't know if his whole family is dead or alive. I'll have to trouble you to go to the lower 3-star body. It's not far, about 100 years. You don't have to report to me, just burn some incense. Smoky Chang raised her hand and hit him. Lu Xiaoyi jumped far away and laughed. I'm all alone. What personal matters do I have to deal with? Senior sister, why are you worried about this? On the other hand, when you reach Weijian Mountain, you have to think about how to get a sword case. I have an idea. There are a lot of bachelors in Weijian Mountain. Why don't you just marry over? Then you'll have everything. There weren't many happy days and gatherings. Even Ling Ruofeng's group didn't dare to invite him. He was no longer the unknown junior brother, but the eldest senior brother of more than 20,000 Foundation establishment swordsmen in Xianxiu Peak. There was a huge difference between them. Lu Xiaoyi didn't think that he was that different, but in the eyes of others, the change in status meant a lot. They weren't close friends. Slowly, they would fade away. He wouldn't deliberately make friends with others, and others wouldn't flatter him blindly. That was it. 3 years later, he didn't participate in the Xianyuan external sword competition. In fact, not only did he not participate, even second senior brother, third senior brother, and all the people on the ranking list didn't participate. To experienced and knowledgeable cultivators, the competition between swordsmen and swordsmen didn't mean much. They used the same philosophy, similar systems, similar tactics, and the same fearless style. In the end, it was a competition to see whose flying sword could carve the most sword formations, be faster, and be heavier. The real mirror to measure a swordsman was a Dharma cultivator. Unfortunately, Dharma cultivators wouldn't be so free as to be their whetstone. 5 years later, a group of external swordsmen from Weijian Mountain came to Xianyuan for an exchange. Lu Xiaoyi didn't participate as well. Perhaps they were reminded by the higher-ups of Weijian Mountain, but the arrogant Weijian Mountain didn't propose to compete with Lu Xiaoyi. They only taught the external swordsmen from Xianyuan a lesson like they did every time they came, including second senior brother. The Sword Aura Rushing Heaven Pavilion was happy to see this. It helped the external swordsmen from Xianyuan to recognize their own strength. They didn't want to use Xuanyuan's name to swagger around outside. The martial uncles from the Rushing Heaven Pavilion seemed to have forgotten about Lu Xiaoyi. They had the same problem as the elders from Weijian Mountain, Jean Dan. They didn't forget about him, but they were afraid of both sides. Xianyuan was afraid that if this unreliable eldest senior brother lost, the morale of the external swordsmen from Xianyuan would drop again. They had already treated Lu Xiaoyi as a benchmark, a name card. It didn't matter if he could fight or not. He was ranked here, so he was the target of publicity. Weijian Mountain knew that they couldn't win, so they didn't mention it. No one would travel thousands of miles to get beaten up, so it was better to avoid him. During this time, there were countless gatherings of young experts in the western region. There were gatherings between those on the ranking list, those below the ranking list, those between friendly forces, those with bad intentions, those with generous rewards, and so on. Almost every gathering was specially invited to the Foundation establishment eldest senior brother from Xuanyuan's external swordsman, but the Sword Aura Rushing Heaven Pavilion used all kinds of excuses to reject them. On this point, Gu Ming had really done what he had promised him. But this time, he couldn't hide anymore. Gu Ming personally sent him a message through the sword talisman, asking him to prepare. Prepare for the upcoming confrontation between Xuan Yuan's external swordsmen. This was an ancient and long-lasting tradition. It was different from the small fight between Lu Xiaoyi and the internal swordsman last time. That was a show of strength by a Foundation establishment newbie, so it didn't mean anything. This time, newbies and veterans weren't qualified to participate in the confrontation. Those who were qualified to participate were the people on the ranking list of the internal and external swordsmen. No matter if you were ranked first or 1000, no one could hide. Chapter 385. From Lu Xiaoyi's point of view, the inner and outer swordsmanship competition that was held once every 50 years was a tradition for the inner swordsmen to teach the outer swordsmen how to behave. The outer swordsman brothers relied on their numbers and were a little dishonest. The inner swordsman brothers would find an excuse to beat them up. For tens of thousands of years, the outer swordsmen had been trampled, educated, and rubbed against without exception. It was a very simple system of drawing lots to determine the winner. The external sword sect had never obtained the final victory. They had never entered the final round. They had never entered the top 4. The best result was that they had entered the top 8 a few times. This was their threshold, and they could not advance any further. This was a grand festival in Xianyuan because the battle was open to all swordsmen, regardless of their level. The goal of the Xianyuan higher-ups was very clear. They wanted the disciples to see what a real battle was and what real swordsmanship was. Through this, they could obviously improve themselves. They could always learn something from it, and comprehend something from it. It was a great guide to the perfection of their swordsmanship system. This was something that masters could not teach and could not be found in books. Because there were very few people, only 40 inner swordsmen and 21 outer swordsmen, there were not many battles. After the first round, there were only 30 left. In the second round, there were 15. In the third round, there were 8. The winner would be decided in the 6th round. Short time meant high intensity and competition. Compared to the outer swordsmen's own small competition, they wanted to drag it out for a year and a half. In the end, they were too lazy to even watch it when it was time to fight for the championship. Is it completely random? Lu Xiaoyi asked. Gu Ming nodded. Yes. But there are seeds. We can't let the strong ones at the top of the ranking meet in the first round. Under the fight of the sword Chi rushing heaven pavilion, the top 10 inner swordsmen and you are the strongest seeds. The top 100 are the second strongest seeds. Yes, they are all inner swordsmen. The rest is random distribution. Little e, the rushing heaven pavilion did not give you any tasks in the past 10 years, right? Since that's the case, you have to do your best this time. You can't let us outer swordsmen be disgraced. Can you make it to the top 4? Lu Xiaoyi was speechless. External swordsman hasn't been able to do this for tens of thousands of years, and you're just going to put the burden on your disciples' shoulders? After 10 years, Gu Ming had some understanding of this strange disciple, so he didn't waste any words. Top 4. The outer storehouse of Thousand Virtues Peak includes all the materials and sword embryos in the official workshop. As long as you like it, you can take it. I don't want a single spirit stone from you. Lu Xiaoyi thought for a while and asked cautiously. What if I'm first? Gu Ming smiled slyly. He had been waiting for this sentence. Firstly, Qianqiu Peak's treasury will be open to you. You can take whatever you want. You should know that only Jin Dan and even Yuanying are qualified to use the sword embryo and materials there. Lu Xiaoyi could not help but be tempted by such a huge temptation. He also knew that he could no longer keep a low profile. He would use this internal and external sword battle as the starting point for his rise. He was qualified to be the strongest seed, although his qualifications were a little forced. 10 years ago, when the 5th Ring Foundation establishment ranking had placed him at 11th place, it had been 3 times since then. However, his 11th place had not budged at all. The matter was obvious. The person who made the ranking firmly believed that he had top-notch strength. As long as he performed a little, he would be able to enter the top 10. Therefore, his 11th place was unshakable. This was a kind of appreciation. He was very curious. What was the reason why the person who made the ranking thought so highly of him? Marshal uncle, who is the person who made this ranking? What kind of power did it? Has there never been a deviation before? Gu Ming smiled. Of course there have been deviations. However, the so-called ranking is a place where the strong survive and the weak are eliminated. Young people strive to catch up, and the younger generation surpasses the older generation. Isn't that normal? Within the top 10 ranks, it doesn't mean that those who are ranked at the top will be able to defeat those behind them. What they lack is an opportunity to perform, a moment of glory. This is why the ranking is divided into several levels. The top 10, the top 30, and the top 100. The general gap in strength is still accurate. No one doubts it. Except for you. Lu Xiaoyi ignored his attack. I remember that there are 2 inner swordsmen who are ranked in the top 10. Gu Ming's face was full of helplessness. Your information is outdated. One of them has already been promoted to Jin Dan. Moreover, he entered the Jin Dan ranking in the 3rd year after he was promoted to Jin Dan. Such a person, sigh. Lu Xiaoyi wanted to get to the bottom of this, because this concerned his opponent. Which one? Gu Ming looked at this disciple who was theoretically the strongest in the outer sword. He knew what this kid meant. He was asking who his opponent would be in the end. Did he really want to fight for first place? Although it was a little arrogant, it was normal for a swordsman. However, the rule in Cheongding was that the inner swordsman would always fight for first place, while the outer swordsman would always fight for second place. It's glorious light. Lu Xiaoyi understood. He did not care about the ranking, but even if he did not care, there were countless people around him who talked about it every day. Especially his senior sister, he knew a lot from her nagging. There were 2 strongest inner swordsmen in Xianyuan. Glorious Light was ranked 2nd, and Bright Light was ranked 9th. He was the leader of the entire Xianyuan Foundation establishment group. He was the real eldest senior brother, not only in the inner sword, but also in the outer sword. He was not like Lu Xiaoyi, who had closed the door to the outer sword. Gu Ming continued. It's not just him. In fact, among the people who have always been in the top 10 of the Foundation establishment ranking, a total of 4 have been promoted to Jin Dan, including the top 3 and the other one. Therefore, this year's top 10 has changed a lot. Everyone says that this year's batch is slightly weaker than before. However, this has nothing to do with you. You just need to focus on your own cultivation and get a good result in the inner and outer sword battles to bring glory to our outer sword. After that, you still have 10 years to sharpen yourself. I see that you've already reached the peak of the middle stage, and you're only a step away from the late stage. Compared to the time you took to enter the sect, this kind of progress can't be considered amazing, but it's still considered very fast. Lu Xiaoyi was somewhat curious. What's the fastest time to reach the late stage? Gu Ming glanced at him. As elders, we usually don't talk about these things because it'll affect a lot of people. In fact, how fast one's cultivation grows after the foundation establishment stage doesn't determine whether a cultivator has a chance to form their gold core or not. Of course, there are definitely more chances. However, for you, it doesn't matter if you know about these things. They shouldn't create obstacles for your temperament. You need to set a goal for yourself. Let's not talk about history. There are too many coincidences. There are those who entered the Jin Dan before they entered the foundation establishment stage, and then they exploded and died. Let's just talk about now. Glorious Light reached the late stage 30 years after the foundation establishment stage. Bright Light took 40 years, which is your current time. Therefore, you see, in fact, compared to them, your speed is very ordinary. Lu Xiaoyi sighed. A genius was a genius. In fact, other than his unique ability to produce the sword spirit of a flying sword, he was really very ordinary in other aspects. This was what he thought, but in reality, there were many things that he couldn't see from his position. It was like darkness under the light. For example, the talent to kill. To him, this was a very normal choice, but it was a realm that others couldn't reach in their lifetime. To a swordsman, was there anything more important than this? Chapter 386. P.S. I've finally repaid my debt. Let's go for a drink tonight. Do you have a monthly ticket to go with my wine? The arena for the inner and outer sword duels was set on the snowy plains below the hidden sword peak. The reason why it was set on the outer sword's territory was because there were too many spectators. There were more than 20,000 Foundation establishment cultivators. Excluding those who were on guard duty outside, those who were out on missions, those who were traveling, those who were in seclusion, and those who weren't interested, there were at least 10,000 of them. Of course, there were no tables, chairs, melon seeds, or tea. Everyone was scattered on the snowy plains. Above their heads was a huge little world. It was transparent, and other than a faint light shield that proved that there was a little world here, there were no other obstacles. The space was dozens of miles wide. It was much bigger than Lu Xiaoyi's battle barrier on Fangting Island. This was a swordsman's specialty. They had to be given enough space to move around in order to display their swordsmanship. Unlike the cultivators of the Three Pure Ones, they couldn't wait to shrink the space to the size of a cage so that the swordsman couldn't run. What surprised Lu Xiaoyi the most was that there were two perfected masters presiding over the duels. One was an inner sword cultivator, and the other was an outer sword cultivator. It was normal that he didn't recognize them. The range of activities of small Foundation establishment cultivators like him was completely different from the upper-level perfected masters. In fact, the inner and outer sword duels were small matters to the upper levels of Xianyuan. They weren't worth paying attention to. The reason why they sent perfected masters to preside over the duels was that only perfected masters could display the full power of the Foundation establishment cultivators. They didn't need to be timid and afraid of everything. Once swordsmen had misgivings about fighting, there was no way they could fight. Jin Dan wasn't as good in this aspect. In order to avoid real casualties, they didn't dare to let their flying swords get too close to the cultivators. If they interfered too early, it would affect the outcome and cause injustice. They were all Xuanyuan's best seeds. If they died in their own sex sword duels, it would be a joke if word got out. Lu Xiaoyi found a familiar face among the inner sword cultivators. Yan Bo! This guy was also in the ranking? He didn't even tell him about his senior sister. Needless to say, he must have felt that his ranking couldn't be compared to Lu Xiaoyi's, so he simply didn't say anything. He was willing to suffer because he wanted to save face. Lu Xiaoyi didn't care about that and directly walked over. "Senior brother! What are you up to, sneaking around like this?" Yan Bo was embarrassed. "Hurry up and leave. Nothing good ever happens when I see you." Remember, be careful when you draw lots. If you draw me, we'll break off our friendship. Yan Bo still didn't want to fight with his former junior brother. If he lost, it would be too shameful. The other external swordsmen were much easier to deal with. Only this brat was too sinister. He was too scheming when fighting. Lu Xiaoyi was the only one who walked over to greet him before the battle started. The other external swordsmen were more cautious. They stood solemnly and gathered their momentum for the upcoming battle. Everyone wanted to change history, but imagination and reality were always incomparably contradictory. Among the two swordsmen, the inner sword was in charge of hosting the battle, while the outer sword was in charge of drawing lots. Because the number of inner swordsmen was twice as high as the number of outer swordsmen on the ranking, there were still 22 inner swordsmen who needed to compete with their fellow inner swordsmen. There was no other way. Who asked the outer swordsmen to be so weak? Xuanyuan's tradition was very straightforward. The pace was very fast, and there were no formalities. Once everyone was present, the outer swordsmen immediately began to draw lots. At this time, the snowy plains of Hidden Sword Peak were already crowded with people. Lu Xiaoyi was the strongest seed. This also meant that he would definitely draw an inner sword cultivator who was ranked at the bottom. From this point of view, the probability of him going up against Yen Bo wasn't small. It was just that he felt a little embarrassed. Cultivators were very open-minded about this. Everyone here was a fellow disciple. Unless you didn't go up, you had to be mentally prepared to face a familiar face. However, Lu Xiaoyi's luck still followed probability. His opponent was an unfamiliar outer sword cultivator, Guangzhu. He was an old Foundation establishment cultivator who was ranked around 600. Based on his ranking alone, he was even above Yen Bo. The first round thus began. The speed was just as shocking. If it was another sect that held a similar internal competition, there would definitely be dozens or even dozens of battle arenas. This was especially true for Dharma Meridians. Because of the dragging and slow pace, rather than calling it a battle, it would be better to call it a mutual discussion of the Tao. In the cultivation world, among the main orthodoxies, the battle between Dharma cultivators was the slowest. Swordsman's battle was the shortest. This was a publicly acknowledged fact. In the words of body cultivators, one raised but not firm, the other drained like a waterfall. Of course, due to the fact that body cultivators would often transform into their Dharma forms and cause earth-shattering battles, Dharma cultivators and swordsmen's evaluation of body cultivators' battles was that they were too congested and couldn't enter the right path. The battle between orthodoxies was the main theme of the cultivation world. It had never stopped since the beginning of cultivation. They weren't wrong to say that a swordsman's ability to vent was like a waterfall. Close, attack, clash, fly apart, and mouth. This was the norm. 1, 2, 3, pay the bill. It was reasonable for the sect to only arrange this space. Everyone was doing this, and Lu Xiaoyi was no exception. He understood the significance of everyone's competition. To be honest, those who were able to stand here were all veterans of hundreds of battles. Whether it was between fellow sect members or against other orthodoxies, they had fought countless battles. Especially between fellow sect members who had fought for at least 100 years. They knew each other's skills very well. Furthermore, it was not appropriate for them to play dirty in front of everyone. Therefore, everyone agreed to compete in the most basic aspects. Range, sword speed, sword frequency, power, control, reaction. This kind of competition was the most exciting when both parties were in close contact. If the range was shorter, the speed of the sword would be slower, the frequency of the sword would be slower, the power would be weaker, the control would be cruder, and the reaction would be slower. Manipulating the sword was not only the essence of the inner sword, it was also the only way to use the outer sword. When two sword cultivators manipulated the sword, there were countless ways to manipulate it. Kiting, biting tails, circling, secret techniques, teleporting, swaying, colliding. It was impossible to predict what kind of trajectory two fast-moving humans could create in the vast space. However, there was one thing. The most thrilling, most exciting, most direct, and fastest way to solve the problem was to collide. This was also the most important test of a swordsman's courage and reaction to an enemy. There was no hard and fast standard. When both parties collided, starting from 3,000 or 4,000 feet away, how many swords would you send out? How many moves would you send out? How would you attack or defend? How would you counter? If 3,000 or 4,000 feet could not be separated, then 2,000 feet, 1,000 feet. The rhythm became faster and faster, the number of flying swords increased, and the distance became shorter and shorter. It was purely based on instincts, and there was no room for thought. The result would be that I'm standing, and you're falling. I'm the standard. This was the real scene of a Xianyuan swordsman's internal competition. They disdained trickery, and loved to lick the blood on the tip of their blade, dancing on the edge of the blade. This was the core of a swordsman's strength. This was also the reason why swordsmen's battle records were so brilliant. They were better at fighting on the front lines. Chapter 387. To Lu Xiaoyi, this kind of fighting style had both advantages and disadvantages. The disadvantage was that he couldn't use any of his sneaky tactics. but the advantage was that his flying sword was a powerful single sword. His attention was focused on Guangming, who was also his last opponent. If he didn't drop the ball midway, then according to the division of the strongest seed, they would only meet at the end. Guangming seemed to be very relaxed when facing his opponent. As he approached quickly, he casually erased his opponent's attack and casually sent out a few sword strikes. Just like that, he casually sent his opponent out of the battle. In his carelessness, he showed great confidence. That external sword expert couldn't even arouse his desire to fight. A terrifying opponent wasn't because of his imposing manner, but because of his leisurely stroll. What he didn't know was that when he appeared, he would become the focus of all the swordsmen in the snowfield. The strength of the inner sword had been going on for tens of thousands of years. It was so strong that people didn't feel it at all. It was natural, and there was no sense of novelty or anticipation. However, he was different. He was the representative of the outer sword's counterattack. Moreover, he was low-key and rarely showed himself in public. Therefore, he attracted the curiosity of everyone, including the outer sword and the inner sword. They were curious as to how he managed to climb to the 11th place without fighting with the previous ranking. Would this battle between the inner and outer swords in Xianyuan be the downfall of this new outer sword senior brother? Of course, all the participating swordsmen were also paying attention to him. Whether it was the inner sword or the outer sword, none of them had really seen him compete with others. They needed to establish a benchmark, a position, so that they could know their own position in the upcoming battle. Lu Xiaoyi didn't fight for a position. When the battle space was large enough, it didn't matter if you fought or not. Because no matter how fast you were, you couldn't be fast enough to force your opponent against the wall of space. This was completely different from the battle space on Fangting Island. He maintained a medium speed so that he could launch a thunderous attack from the best position. He didn't want to hide anymore. He couldn't hide his true strength on a stage like Xianyuan. It was too childish to try to hide his true strength and become number one. After crossing 400 feet, the Four Seasons sword suddenly flew out as fast as lightning. He didn't have any thoughts of using the second flying sword. Since he was going to fight, then he would fight cleanly. This kind of shooting range was the best among all the participants present. At least he had shown it, while Light had yet to fully display his abilities. The flight of the Four Seasons seemed to follow some kind of mysterious trajectory. It was as if they had taken a long detour, but it also didn't seem to affect the approach of the flying swords at all. However, this mysterious trajectory faintly revealed a kind of domain of power. Sheep horn. All the spectators could see that this person was really arrogant. He actually used the swordsmanship of an inner sword to deal with an inner sword. Guangzhou was still calm, as if he hadn't seen his opponent's long range at all. So what if it was a long journey? It only meant that he would be the first to be attacked. If he managed to block his opponent's attack and entered the range of 300 feet, everyone would be within his shooting range. What was the point of talking about distance? He did not have a good impression of this external swordsman. He thought that he was a little silly and had a slow mind. Since he was good at long-range attacks, then of course he had to increase the distance between him and his opponent. Why did he have to learn how to fight head-on? Collision was just one of the methods, and no one said that it had to be this way. Playing to one's strengths and avoiding one's weaknesses was the true essence of a swordsman, and not following the crowd blindly. Both parties quickly closed in. Before they entered the range of 300 feet, Guangzhou had already sent out his sword Light. It wasn't to intercept, but to attack. The confidence of an external swordsman was already rooted in his blood. Whether it was his senior or junior brother didn't mean much to him. To him, it was just an external swordsman, and that was it. He still used the method of dealing with an external swordsman to deal with him, and continued to attack. Although the flying swords had already exceeded his shooting range, don't forget that both parties were quickly closing in. The 3 sword lights were his warning to his opponent as an internal swordsman. There had never been an internal swordsman who completely defended against an external swordsman. This was a tradition that had been passed down for tens of thousands of years, and it was not to be challenged. After that, he began to organize his own defense. A swordsman's defense was divided into 3 layers: long-range flying swords to intercept, close-range escaping techniques to dodge, and finally, his body to resist. He didn't want to bleed himself, and he didn't want to retreat in such a collision. That was the choice of the weak, so he could only choose to intercept with his flying swords. His opponent's flying sword was already close to 200 feet. Considering the relative speed, he had less than 2 breaths of time to send out at least 20 sword lights. That was enough. When the first sword light was sent out, his opponent's flying sword moved in a mysterious way and missed. The second sword light was also missed. The third sword light was accurately hit after some adjustments, but his sword light was like an ant trying to shake a tree in front of his opponent's physical sword. It didn't have any effect. In the blink of an eye, 10 sword lights were intercepted, but they didn't have any effect. This time, Guangzhou was serious. He had no choice but to be serious. If he couldn't block this sword, he would lose. Because the distance was very close, the sword light that followed collided with his opponent's flying sword without missing a beat. It was only at this moment that he truly felt the strength of his opponent's flying sword. It was an unshakable strength. Using all his strength, he sent out another 11 sword lights. When his opponent's flying sword was within 10 feet of him, his flying sword system was declared ineffective. All that was left was to resist while dodging. But his opponent's flying sword was unusually nimble, and his spiritual sense was firmly locked on. There was no chance. The moment the flying sword pierced his body, an indescribable power suddenly descended. The 4 seasons stopped a few inches in front of his chest. The host of the Inner Sword Immortal shouted, "This battle, cigarette stub wins, Guangzhou loses!" Lu Xiaoyi bowed and left the field. Thunderous cheers came from the snowy plains below. They had already fought more than 20 battles. Basically, the battles ended quickly, but those who fell were all external swords. The only external swords that won were still fighting fiercely without any excitement. Until De Shixing came out and solved the problem with one sword. This was the crushing of strength. Before, it was always the internal swords that crushed the external swords. Now, there was finally an external sword that could crush the internal swords. What did this mean? It meant that the external swords were still promising and not useless. There were also ripples in the group of internal swords. Guangzhou returned to his fellow disciples without saying a word. He had lost face and had no face to defend himself. But as De Shixiang, Guang comforted him. "Don't take it to heart. It's not easy for the external swords to have talents. We should be happy for them. Be more open-minded. If the external swords had a group of people with such strength, we would have a lot less trouble." Guangzhou then spoke. "That external sword is too heavy. I feel that it's not just the addition of the sheep horn technique. There should be something else." Guang said seriously. "This person is able to rank 11th on the ranking list. He's not someone with an undeserved reputation. His sheep horn technique is not worth mentioning. It's just the beginning of this path. It's far from being profound. The reason why the sword is heavy is because the flying sword has a spirit. You all have to be careful about this." The internal swords looked at each other. The external sword had a sword spirit in the Zhuji stage. No wonder this person's ranking rose so quickly. Chapter 388. Lu Xiaoyi returned to the group of outer swords. Along the way, every outer sword nodded in greeting. Although no one called him senior brother, their subtle actions showed the subtle changes in their hearts. Swordsmen were like this. Strength was the most important thing. If you were capable, nothing else mattered. He did not hold back in this attack. It was normal that Guangzhou could not block it. It would be abnormal if he could. 10 years, a whole 10 years. The 4 seasons sword spirits could already surpass the 5 gates on Bo Lang's slope. The strength of the sword spirits brought about the strength of the flying swords. The 4 seasons flying swords formation had already been recorded to the 14th level. It had already far exceeded the upper limit of the foundation establishment stage sword technique. The imbalance of 37 had now developed to 28. The direct result was the abnormal penetrative power of the first sword. The only thing he did not use was the star's sword force that he was best at. He chose the sheep horn technique that he had just comprehended. He hoped that in the following battles, he could rely on consecutive victories to achieve the goal of comprehending the force of might. It would be best to accumulate this force for the final battle and display its power in the battle against the light. All of these needed to be won in one strike. He could not hide it any longer. Amidst the excitement of the outer swords below, the first round ended quickly. From the overall results, only 4 of the 21 outer swords were left. But this time, the outer swords had something to look forward to, not as a whole, but as individuals. Half of the 64 outer swords were eliminated, leaving 32 outer swords. Lu Xiaoyi drew Guangqun, an inner swordsman ranked within the top 300. The outer swordsman's draw was very fair. It was so fair that Lu Xiaoyi did not have the slightest bit of surprise. When it was Lu Xiaoyi's turn, everyone knew that this was a real battle to test his abilities. This was because the swordsman opposite him would no longer treat him as an outer swordsman, but as an outer swordsman ranked 11th on the ranking. Different judgments of strength would lead to different tactical responses. This time, there was no luck to speak of. Lu Xiaoyi still attacked from 4,000 feet away. But this time, his opponent did not attack him. Instead, he chose to defend first. The inner swordsman also wanted to know how heavy his sword was. Was it able to break through Zhu Guangzhu's defense just now, or did he still have strength to spare? Guangqun had tested it, and it was heavy without a ceiling. Even if he used all of his strength to defend against the flying sword, he would not be able to effectively intercept it. It was still a single sword. Taoist Master Inner Sword announced the result. This result proved that the internal sword's plan of using this method to end the battle had failed. If this continued, other than light, none of the other internal swords dared to say that they had the confidence to receive this sword. Changing the method and truly moving the sword showed that the inner sword had lost a lot of confidence in front of him. Psychologically, he had already established his own advantage. Down below, there was a large group of cultivators who belonged to the cultivators of the outer realm. Ling Ruofeng was among them, sighing. "They're all from the same place. They were all practicing swordsmanship at the same time. Why do I feel like I'm practicing needles while little E is practicing hammers? Why is the difference so huge? It doesn't make sense." The person beside him laughed. "The key is the name. Look at eldest senior brother's Buddhist name, cigarette butt. The head of the smoke generation. This name is not normal. Ruofeng, you were too careless when you chose your name. How could you miss out on such a good name? If it really doesn't work, Smoke's fart will do too." The external swords saw hope. Up until now, the situation had gradually become clear. It was hard to say about the other external sword senior brothers, but eldest senior brother Cigarette but would definitely enter the front ranks. The biggest question was, how far would he go? The external swords Jin Dan looked at the problem differently. Gu Shan, who had always been tireless in teaching, frowned. Little Yi's flying sword has almost reached the pinnacle of foundation establishment. In this aspect, even light is inferior. But a battle is not just about the distance and weight of the sword. Once the two sides choose to move their swords back and forth, such a heavy sword may not be able to find an opportunity. Everyone nodded. Compared to external swords, the internal sword would always be inferior in terms of weight. This was the difference between a physical sword and sword energy. The physical would always be greater than the virtual. But the internal sword had another advantage, and that was the frequency of the sword. When both sides were within the shooting range, the internal sword's frequency could reach the level of 10 swords in a breath. For example, Zhu Guanquan. As for light, it was still a mystery. They could unleash their swords endlessly. As long as they had a trace of mana, they would never stop. But external swords could not do that. How many flying swords could an external sword box keep? For foundation establishment, 7 or 8 flying swords were the limit. Even Jin Dan cultivators like them could only refine a dozen flying swords. They would be at a great disadvantage in a battle. Sword spirits were rare. It was already a great fortune for a flying sword to produce a sword spirit. How could one expect the same luck to befall them twice? Unless there was a special method, or a special constitution and spirit. Therefore, when the internal sword truly activated the kiting sword, a flying sword with a sword spirit would appear very weak. It would not be able to produce that kind of storm-like feeling. And once the internal sword grasped the initiative, the power of a heavy sword would not be able to be unleashed. Of course, this would depend on the choice of battle tactics. If Lu Xiaoyi could unleash his strength and seize the opportunity to attack from a distance, then he would win. Once he was entangled, even if it was a flying sword with a sword spirit, it would be very difficult to completely block the inner sword's storm-like attacks. Lu Xiaoyi had only been in the sect for 40 years. How many flying swords could he refine? Under normal circumstances, he could refine 2 or 3 flying swords. Reproducing a sword spirit would probably take even longer. This was the reason why the Jin Dan cultivators were worried. At this point, the battle had truly entered the exciting stage. They were starting to use all kinds of methods. There were 16 people left. 14 internal swords and 2 external swords. Lu Xiaoyi and his second senior brother. Everyone knew that his second senior brother would not be able to survive the next round. Everyone's eyes were on him. If he lost again, it was estimated that more than half of the spectators would leave. Everyone was an external sword cultivator. Was it interesting to watch the internal sword cultivators fight? There was still not much time to rest. The enlightened masters were too lazy to waste their lives on such an occasion. The first match was his second senior brother. This was a hurdle that he could not avoid. He wanted to step over it, but he lacked the strength to support it. His current opponent was the internal sword cultivator ranked in the top 100 of the 5 rings ranking list. Whether in name or in reality, he was better than him. Lu Xiaoyi had always suspected that the external sword cultivator had thrown the match in the drawing of lots so that his disciples would not meet a stronger opponent. But now, it was difficult to use this method. It was too conspicuous. The two of them did not use the method of collision to determine the winner. It was not that the internal sword cultivator was weak, but that his second senior brother was weak. He knew that he had no chance in a collision, so he changed his moves in an attempt to find a loophole in his opponent's moves. The result was very normal. He did not find a loophole in the internal sword cultivator's moves. Instead, the internal sword cultivator found a loophole in his moves. There was no suspense. Chapter 389. Lu Shi was now the only child, a lonely branch. Under the gaze of tens of thousands of eyes, he finally realized the responsibility on his shoulders. There were some things that didn't need to be said. When things developed to a certain point, you would naturally take the initiative to shoulder the burden. This was the intention of the Soaring Heaven Pavilion's golden cores, to make it so that you had nowhere to run. Fall into the trap. This was the value of the eldest senior brother. Yan Dao was one of the earliest members of the Yan generation. He had entered the sect nearly 50 years earlier than Lu Xiaoyi. He was considered young among the cultivators on the inner sword ranking, but his strength was not simple. He was ranked 29th in the 5-ring foundation building ranking, belonging to the second tier. Just from the ranking alone, he was in existence on the same level as Lu Xiaoyi. This was also the level that cultivators were most unconvinced of. Everyone had a competitive heart, let alone cultivators. It was just that the higher the realm, the deeper the concealment. He felt that he had an obligation to uphold the tradition of the inner sword. He couldn't push everything to his senior brother Guangming. He hoped that he could be the Terminator. He didn't think that this was a difficult task. This so-called eldest senior brother of the external sword was indeed powerful, but he had good eyesight and could vaguely see the truth of the matter. For example, the power of the second sword after the first was not as strong. His eyesight was indeed very sharp. Although the unbalanced fulcrum was Lu Xiaoyi's original creation, in this cultivation world, nothing could be hidden from others. As long as you used it, people would be able to guess the truth from the subtle differences in your method of retrieving the flying sword. In other words, as long as he withstood the first sword, the rest of the rhythm would be controlled by him. For someone like him who had been fighting for a long time, dodging the opponent's big move was a necessary skill. He had many methods. This was the bloody experience of fighting against a magic cultivator. It wasn't something that could be taught. This was the reason why he was ranked 29th. He had battle experience against the top 10 cultivators. In terms of rich experience, those inner sword cultivators who were ranked higher than him might not be able to compare to him. Entering the space, first sliding 10 li, then leaning to the side, entering the sword stance. What he practiced was the use ancient escape technique. Combined with the fire and water escape technique of the 5 elements, he was known for his elusive escape technique. No matter how heavy his opponent's sword was, it couldn't lock him down. His opponent was still unhurried. The starlight in his hand did not have a trace of smoke or fire. Removing the sword case on his back, no one would doubt that he was a spell cultivator. The star department was a very secluded path. There were also senior and junior brothers in the inner sword department, but none of them were as carefree as the outer sword eldest senior brother in front of him. Just from this point alone, it was not without reason that this person was valued by the rankings. 4,000 feet away, the outer sword shot out as expected. It was as wild as ever, and it directly attacked. The Flu Dao's reaction was completely different from the previous cultivators. He didn't stop, nor did he hesitate. Instead, he met the sword head-on, but he didn't release a single sword. To meet the sword, one needed courage and a precise grasp of distance. If one flew too fast, the sword would collide. If one flew too slow, the effect would be less than ideal. Flu Dao was very familiar with this technique. It was his specialty in the arena. First, he wondered, making the opponent think that he was waiting for an opportunity to fight. Then, he rushed, going back to his old path and catching the opponent off guard. Colliding had always been the strong point of the inner sword. He didn't believe that a young outer sword eldest senior brother could beat him in this aspect. His opponent was obviously suspicious, and he was even more careful while taking his time. Others might not be able to detect this, but as his opponent, he could keenly sense even the slightest bit of hesitation from his opponent. Now, his opponent's speed had slowed down in an extremely inconspicuous manner, and this was the effect he wanted to achieve. The flying sword was like lightning, and his figure was like flying. At a delicate point, the Flu Dao launched the shadow-attaching sword. This was a high-end application of the inner sword's most practical teleportation technique. As soon as he disappeared, the 4 seasons had passed through his shadow. The timing was just right. Below, there were exclamations, which then turned into sighs. To master this technique, one had to endure countless stabs. A simple shadow-attaching sword was enough to get rid of the outer sword's incomparably powerful first heavy sword. At this moment, the 4 seasons were already behind him. If he wanted to turn around, it would be a second attack with insufficient power. This was Lu Xiaoyi's self-created unbalanced 28 fulcrum point 2. Although the Flu Dao was very clear that after the next weak attack, there would definitely be another heavy attack, it didn't matter. He was fighting for this moment. When his flying sword exploded, he believed that this outer sword wouldn't be able to do anything. After charging forward for a few hundred feet, he revealed his figure. This was because he didn't want to engage in close combat. Close combat was the last resort, and it might not be effective. It was very threatening to Dharma cultivators who were bad at close combat, but to Xianyuan people who were also swordsmen, it was very rare to hear of anyone who was afraid of close combat. His goal was to enter within a distance of 200 feet. At that time, it would be the stage for his flying sword. He really wanted to see how many flying swords with sword spirits this outer sword eldest senior brother could pull out from his sword case. Just as he revealed his figure, his battle instincts had already caused him to explode with a powerful attack. Dozens of flying swords shot out rapidly. After the flying swords shot out, he recovered from his momentary daze and used his divine sense to search for the opponent's position. This was also the ability of a true expert's inner sword. Others needed to lock onto the target with their divine sense before releasing the sword, but he could do so after releasing the sword and then lock onto the target. This was the kind of situation where he could release the sword at the first moment. The essence of a battle was to seize the moment. He did it. However, he didn't do it either. The shadow sword possession was perfect, the distance control was perfect, and the first flying sword was also perfect, but in the end, he was stuck because in the direction his divine sense scanned, there was no trace of the opponent. No matter how perfect the explosion of the flying sword was, it still needed to find the target. If there was no one in front, then there must be someone behind. He didn't panic in the face of danger and continued to fly forward. If the opponent was behind him, the attack would have already begun. He used his divine sense to scan behind him. As expected, the outer sword had unknowingly turned behind him. There was no doubt that when he activated the shadow sword possession, the outer sword must have activated his secret teleportation technique at the same time. He could teleport in front of the flying sword, but the opponent could teleport at the same time as he teleported. The opponent's ability to grasp the timing was above his. What kind of monster was this? However, he didn't have time to think about this. Because the outer sword's first flying sword had turned back and was already within 1,000 feet of him. This flying sword indeed had a sword spirit. It was abnormally agile. Although the distance was very close, he knew that the second attack of this flying sword would be very weak. This was his judgment from the previous 2 battles. Although he didn't understand the principle, he believed in his intuition. There was no room for him to dodge. When the flying sword was within 1,000 feet of the cultivator, and controlled by the sword spirit, he couldn't escape. Of course, there was no need for him to dodge. Against a weak sword, he could just scatter it with his sword. Even in such a dangerous situation, he didn't forget to attack his opponent. Several flying swords attacked his opponent. This was a swordsman's principle: never passively defend. His explosive power was still there. In an instant, several flying swords had already collided. His control was different from Guan Kuan's. He didn't make any mistakes. The flying swords he sent out all hit the materialized sword without exception. Then, Yan Dao's heart sank. This sword wasn't a weak sword at all. It was as strong as before and heavy as ever. Did I guess wrong? Yan Dao smiled bitterly. That flying sword had pushed through all the obstructions and stopped directly on his forehead. This wasn't the opponent showing mercy. This was a real person making a move. He had lost, and he had lost decisively. In theory, it was still a single sword. This person was a monster. Chapter 390. Author's note: Old man Wen Wu is pressing me, and sloth is also on his last breath. With all these reasons, it's normal to have 1 more update today and 3 more tomorrow. I really can't take it anymore. Lu Xiaoyi exited the space and pursed his lips. Playing mind games with him? His original 8-8 imbalance pivot could be 8 first and then 2, or 2 first and then 8. Why must the first strike be a heavy sword? It could be a feint first, and then a real one. After this battle, the situation was clear. The tens of thousands of cultivators present understood that the final battle would be between the 5th-ranked light and the 11th-ranked cigarette butt. His opponent, the 29th-ranked cigarette butt, was also dealt with in one strike. Ordinary inner swords could no longer stop this emerging outer sword hero. Not only was his sword heavy, but what was even more frightening was his grasp of the battle situation. His control of timing. His performance was top-notch, but he still had not discovered a weakness. Moreover, even if he did reveal a weakness, would anyone believe him? Was it a trap? Was it a trap? The outer swords on the snowy plains were excited. The outer swords were about to make a comeback. They were lucky enough to witness this miracle. The Jean Dan of the outer swords could not hold back their joy. A real hero had jumped out from the cracks of a rock. He was destined to leave a deep mark in the history of Xianyuan. Light took a deep breath and smiled. I'm luckier than senior brother Light Glory. I'm lucky enough to witness the rise of the outer swords, but he doesn't have the chance. This battle between the inner and outer swords is starting to get interesting. There were only 8 left. One outer sword was unusually eye-catching and became the target of public criticism. This was an unavoidable outcome, and he was already prepared for it. His power had already gathered to a certain extent. He did not know when he would be able to break through if this continued, so he could only take it one step at a time. When Smokey arrived, there was only one battle left. She had just returned from the western regions and rushed here as soon as she heard the news. Fortunately, she did not miss it. She did not care about the curious gazes of the other cultivators and went directly to Lu Xiaoyi's side. Little E! This light came from Qin Kong. I know a little about his situation. Lu Xiaoyi stopped her. Senior sister! Don't say anything, just let me handle it myself. Smokey looked at him and sighed in her heart. She was too concerned and had oversimplified the situation. For a capable swordsman, the strength of their opponent was not that important. The key to a battle was how to unleash one's abilities, not how to constantly think about the opponent. If his opponent had a powerful divine ability, and he was constantly on guard, would he still be able to strike his own rhythm? Understanding one's opponent was a double-edged sword. Some people liked it, and some didn't. Relatively speaking, the stronger one was, the higher one's realm was, and the more confident one was, the more disdainful one would be of the so-called opponent's secrets. There were tens of thousands of cultivators in this world. Who knew who your next opponent would be? Could he understand it? He didn't lose his confidence. The way Smokey saw it, this junior brother of his was becoming more and more confident. He was no longer that timid junior brother who led the way in front of the Wolf Ridge and thought of how to scheme against others when he fought. Right now, he was already Xuanyuan's eldest senior martial brother with over 20,000 Foundation establishment swords, not just in name, but in reality. It was even possible for him to become Xuanyuan's eldest senior martial brother with both internal and external sword veins. Seeing the young cultivator she was familiar with grow into a towering tree, she couldn't help but feel somewhat jealous. She could no longer provide him with protection. That little swordsman who had foolishly agreed to everything in the Sword-Chi Rushing Heaven Pavilion was now even disdaining to hear the secret of being the #1 Foundation establishment cultivator in the internal sword. The affairs of the world were hard to predict. The Blue Sea turned into mulberry fields, but in reality, only a few short decades had passed. Someone came to her side and snorted. This brat is going to overturn the heavens. I risked my life to save him in Haloa City. Now he's turning his back on me and wants to trample the entire internal sword under his feet. He doesn't care about our old friendship at all. Hearing this sour tone, it could only be Smokey Wave. But he's my junior martial brother, and always will be. Don't even think about making me call him senior martial brother, Smokey Wave insisted. Smokey Wave sneered. If you don't believe me, just wait and see. Not only will you have to call him senior martial brother in the future, you might even have to call him martial uncle in the future. After a pause, she still couldn't hold back her surging gossipy heart. I just don't know if you want to call him husband? Seeing Smokey Wave's sharp brows looking at him, he didn't know why, but even though his strength was clearly far above hers, he still felt a bit scared. This was the feeling between true friends, right? However, his mouth was still stubborn. Junior Marshal sister, I'm doing this for your own good. Did you know that I obtained information from the most secret of channels? This brat used his official position for personal gain during a mission in Irai. He secretly had an affair with a female cultivator from the Kuandao separation realm on Fonting Island. She's called Han Yen. If you don't have this intention, then just treat it as if I'm farting. If you do have this intention, then you have to hurry up. The one who strikes first gains the advantage, and the one who strikes later suffers. Your location is closer, and the conditions are much more convenient. If you really can't do it, then I'll help you. If you get him drunk one day, Junior Marshal sister, you can force yourself on him. The snowy plains below the hidden sword peak were packed with people. Some of them had jobs, some were in seclusion, and some were uninterested. They all rushed here one after another. In their hearts they were very clear that such a grand occasion only happened once in 10,000 years. Perhaps it wouldn't happen again in 10,000 years. If they missed it, they would never see it again. This was no joke. Even Light felt a trace of indescribable pressure. This was a pressure that he didn't feel when he was on the 5-ring ranking list. The glory of the inner sword would be shouldered by him alone. In the past, there was Senior Marshal Brother Light Brilliance, so he didn't need to think too much about it. Suddenly, a thought flashed through his mind. Would it be that he wouldn't need to think too much about it in the future? Would Xuanyuan's foundation establishment directly change from the era of light brilliance to the era of cigarette butts? He couldn't think like that, or he would lose his sword heart. Ling Ruofeng's group gathered together, nervously looking at the battle space above them. They hoped that one day, they would also stand here and receive the cheers of the crowd. Even if they weren't as glorious as Lil E, it would still be good to show their faces. Who didn't have a desire to improve themselves? The affairs of the world were impermanent. Thinking back to the time when they were plundered, Little E was the most unwilling one. The reason why he had followed them was purely an accident. But now that he thought about it, this was the magic of fate, right? What he didn't want the most, he would get it, and what he wanted, he would get nothing. His opponent, Chao Wendao, had been killed by Liu Yi's scheme, becoming a springboard for fate. How pitiful! At that time, Little E had displayed an extraordinary talent for killing people. Unfortunately, none of them had noticed. That's not right, someone had noticed. Qin Nerong had noticed. But what was the use? Her attention couldn't even keep up with the rise of this new star. After entering and exiting the dome a few times, in a short 40 years, he was going to become Xuanyuan's senior martial brother? She had revised her plan countless times, but she had to change it again and again because her imagination wasn't enough. She wasn't bold enough. Could she be blamed for this? Who would have thought that a little cultivator from a remote astral world would be able to shine in such a big scene like the 5 rings? Where was his limit? Qin Nerong already didn't dare to think about it. Chapter 391. As usual, Lu Xiaoyi advanced at a moderate speed. He was not afraid of the slightest thing, nor was he in a hurry to succeed. He could vaguely feel a kind of power, a power that looked down on his opponent. And because of the existence of this power, he did not hesitate to reject his senior sister's help. If it was before, he would definitely listen. Knowing oneself and knowing one's opponent was the guarantee of victory. But he also knew that if he listened, the power that he had painstakingly cultivated would be gone. Either he chose the power, or he chose to know his opponent's secret. He chose the former, because after comprehending the power of power, this thing would follow him for life. And if he only understood Light's background, it would only solve the problem of this battle. In the last few battles, almost everyone had their own power, and they all had their own trump cards. He won very quickly, but the dangers and difficulties were clear in his heart. His trump cards were revealed one by one. In the 4th battle, the Baishan sword spirit attached to the 4 seasons, and the dual sword spirits attached to the Baishan's mental attack. In the fifth battle, the appearance of the hidden fragrance, flying sword shocked the Jean Dan swordsman. The birth of one sword spirit could be explained by luck, but if there were two sword spirits, even an idiot would know that there was some kind of trick involved. Since the start of the battle, External Sword's spiritual master had been indifferent. But when Lu Xiaoyi revealed the second flying sword with a sword spirit, his expression changed slightly. If this was an experience that could be spread, then Xuanyuan's External Sword sect would change the decline of tens of thousands of years. It might not be able to suppress the Internal Sword sect, but at least they would be on equal footing. This point could be seen from Cigarette Butt's performance this time. Lu Xiaoyi's stunning performance this time was because his two flying swords with sword spirits had alarmed the higher-ups. This was also the main reason why everyone felt that he was strong. Because of this, they had neglected some of the most important qualities of a swordsman, such as decisiveness, insight, and the instinctive sense and grasp of battle opportunities. These things might not be deeply perceived by outsiders, but to the internal swordsman who had participated in the battle, it was unforgettable. This external sword senior brother indeed had a lot of trump cards, but what was even more frightening was his grasp of timing when to use them. This person had the ability to directly turn his trump cards into victory. This ability sounded simple, but was very difficult to execute. To most people, this was an ability that could not be learned, because it was not a simple matter of using a trump card, but when to use it? What was the atmosphere of battle? It was not only a problem of the trump card, but also a problem of the battle mentality of the battle. The most important thing now was, had this eldest senior brother used up all his trump cards? No one would think so. In that case, based on the way he used his trump card, wouldn't the next time he used his trump card signify the end of the battle? This was the application of the force in battle. Through the course of a series of battles, he would imperceptibly influence the opponent's psychology, causing the opponent to be cautious in their suspicions, paranoid in their cautiousness, and timid in their suspicions. Lu Xiaoyi had already understood the true meaning of the force of force. To achieve this, he still needed to fight continuously, and he still needed to pretend to be disdainful of his opponent. One day, he would be able to achieve this by relying on his reputation, environment, speech, and even a certain flashy appearance. That would be the true mastery of the force of force. When Guangming appeared in the arena, the first thing he did was to use a very special force, silent force. Silent force took the meaning of silent heaven and earth, accumulating pressure, and attacking only after the opponent attacked. The stronger the opponent's attack, the stronger the force of force he could condense. This was in consideration of Lu Xiaoyi's invincible and fiery attacks from the very beginning. So far, no one had been able to withstand his first three axes, so they chose to be on the defensive. Being able to make the inner sword take a defensive stance was a victory in terms of mentality. However, Lu Xiaoyi did not know that light silent defense was not as simple as not using the sword. Instead, it would still attack and accumulate silent energy during the attack. This was a very brilliant way of attack and defense. Compared to the silent force of light, the force of might that he had comprehended for the first time was not enough. Instead, it would accelerate the accumulation of his opponent's silent force. There was no difference between silent force and force of might, but there was a difference in the comprehension of cultivators. From this point of view, Lu Xiaoyi's force of might that he had accumulated in the past 5 rounds had been seen through. His opponent's tit-for-tat response had put him in an awkward position instead. Withdrawing the power of intimidation could not really affect the opponent's silence, but it could delay the accumulation of the opponent's silence. If he did not withdraw it, he would be suspected of being too close to the opponent, and would instead accelerate the accumulation of the opponent's silence. As soon as both sides entered the fighting space, before they even saw each other, Lu Xiaoyi had already suffered a loss in terms of force of might. It was not that he had made a wrong choice, but his weakness in understanding the force of might was accurately grasped by his opponent. If he had mastered the force of might to the point of perfection, he would not have been suppressed. It was just a matter of whether he could win with his force of might first, or whether the opponent's silence would succeed in counterattacking. Because he was not familiar with the application of force, Light had taken the initiative before they came into contact. In the battle with Light, Lu Xiaoyi could no longer hide his sword skills, nor could he plan to end the battle quickly. The so-called battle was to display one's strengths to the extreme. His first strength was the length of his sword. Unlike before, when he was 4,000 feet away from his opponent, he began to attack from 5,000 feet away. The 4 seasons came like a shadow. For the swordsmen who were watching the battle below, such a distance was useless. But in their eyes, their eldest senior brother's control of the flying sword from 5,000 feet away was still very skillful. Just this alone was enough to beat most of the cultivators in the same realm. Since he had given up on the long distance, of course, he could not close the distance. Lu Xiaoyi began to control the distance between them to maintain between 4,500 feet to 5,500 feet so that he could only hit the opponent without being hit. This was the classic tactic of the long-distance swordsman. It was widely used. You could not say that this tactic was mediocre just because it was common. This was the most correct choice. Guang Ming was also very depressed. He was not afraid of the opponent's strange tactics. Because his tactics were also very varied, he had been through hundreds of battles, but he did not have any special way to counter this kind of simple, most common, and most unskilled long-range attack. But before he came up with a solution, he had to personally feel the power of the opponent's heavy sword. This was the cornerstone of the tactic. Otherwise, he could not be sure how much effort he had to put in to defend. He was very clear that the frequency of the sword explosion of his fellow disciples was below 15 sword strikes in a breath, but he could easily reach 20 sword strikes in a breath. Not only that, he also had the force of bloody battle to rely on. The closer the opponent's attack was, the heavier his sword she would be. He did not believe that he could not block the opponent's single flying sword with his blocking power. If that was the case, there was no need to fight. Chapter 392. Guang Ming's flying swords had a range of 4,000 feet. This was already a terrifying distance, but he only started to attack when he was 3,000 feet away. He needed to leave a distance of 1,000 feet to confuse his opponent's judgment. The gushing swords formed a line and accurately struck the advancing 4 seasons without missing a single one. This was the embodiment of perfect control of the soul. As the distance got closer, the chain of flying swords became denser and denser. The power of the swords became stronger and stronger. Finally, the invincible 4 seasons stopped advancing. This was the first time they showed signs of exhaustion. Among the spectators, the outer swords watched nervously. They clearly knew what this meant. Many of the inner swords heaved a sigh of relief. They had blocked the attack. The following battle would enter Guang Ming's rhythm. This was because the sharpest part of the outer swords was this invincible heavy sword. Once it was blocked, the inner swords would have an absolute advantage in terms of sword frequency. Even if there was a flying sword with spirit, it was a sword used for sneak attacks and not a sword used for battle. The difference between the two was huge. In Guang Ming's own probing, he had blocked his opponent's heavy sword a total of 14 times. These were not the ordinary 14 times, but the bloody battle flying sword that was stronger as it went on. In all the battles he had fought in his life, this was the first time he had encountered an attack that required him to block 14 times. It was not an injustice for his juniors to lose. If he had not comprehended the bloody battle momentum, it would have been difficult for him to block Guang Ming's attack even if he used all his flying swords. However, this was not the way to compare strength. Guang Ming's sword momentum also had the goat horn momentum. At their level, sword momentum was normal. If you did not comprehend the momentum, you would not be able to enter this circle. He had to try again to determine the pattern of the strength of his opponent's flying swords. This way, he would be more confident in formulating a counterattack strategy. It was said that the Xianyuan swordsman would attack hot-bloodedly. This was wrong. The ferocious attack was only a facade. There was an intricate calculation behind it. In this aspect, he was no different from a spell cultivator. It was just that swordsman's probing was more direct and suffocating. Lu Xiaoyi did not make any changes. Since the opponent did not approach him, he would continue to attack from afar. Light was testing his attack power, and he was also testing Light's defense power. This was a mutual process, and there was no need to talk about who had the upper hand. He could acutely feel the uniqueness of the radiant flying sword. The frequency of the sword far exceeded that of the other inner swords. There were more than 20 swords in every breath. The closer it was to the opponent, the stronger the momentum. He was also considering whether he could break through his opponent's defense if he changed his flying sword to his most powerful attack, Ju City, and if he used the stellar sword force. The answer was yes. However, the prerequisite was that the opponent had no other trump cards. All of this had happened in less than 10 breaths of time, from entering the battle space to approaching and probing. After that, the battle sped up. Since they were all swordsmen, they had no interest in wasting time like spellcasters. Once the probing was over, the outcome would be revealed immediately. Light used Shadow Sword 3 times in a row, and he was already within 3,000 feet of Lu Xiaoyi. Following that, his flying swords flew out like a storm, almost reaching the peak of a cultivator's sword-light division. The timing he chose was very tricky. It was right after Lu Xiaoyi's 4 seasons was 8 times stronger. He had already understood the strength and weakness of this external sword's senior brother's flying swords. After 8 times stronger, it would be 2 times weaker. This would buy him a precious moment of time. As long as his flying swords could entangle his opponent, he was confident that he could make his opponent lose the initiative to attack forever. Shadow Sword was a must-have technique for almost every inner swordsman. It was simple and practical, and could be used to break through, close in, or escape. It was fast and impossible to guard against. Different cultivators had different innate abilities, and their achievements in Shadow Sword were different. For example, Light could use Shadow Sword 3 times in a row in an instant. But for Smoke Duct, it could not be used continuously. There must be a pause in the middle, and the duration was different. This was the reason why Smoke Duct had to face the 4 seasons after he used Shadow Sword once. Of course, Smoke Duct guessed wrong at that time. He thought that the attack was 2 times weaker, but he did not expect it to be 8 times stronger. But this time, Light was very sure that even if the 4 seasons followed him, according to the rule, it must be 2 times weaker. The instant movement of external swords could not be used continuously. For example, Lu Xiaoyi's sky measuring sword ruler was the prerequisite for the flying sword to fly out and then measure. In other words, the direction had been fixed, and the flying sword had lost its suddenness and concealment. The key was that he needed the flying sword to jump out again before he could launch the sky measuring sword ruler for the second time. It was because of the congenital difference in Kung Fu that he could not use the same instant movement to resist Light's 3 consecutive movements. A simple approach was calculated to the extreme by Light. The two of them were originally 5,000 feet apart. Now that he had moved forward to 3,000 feet, he had calculated that even if Lu Xiaoyi moved at the maximum distance, he would not be able to get 2,000 to 3,000 feet away from his back. It was still within the range of his flying sword's control. Unless Lu Xiaoyi chose to get close, but he did not know where Light's final destination was, so it was difficult for him to get close to him. Lu Xiaoyi's speed could not offset such a close distance by relying on the guidance of the starlight alone. This was the qualitative difference between the escape method and teleportation. There was no better way, so he could only block it head-on. Like the Light, he had to rely on his own flying sword to block the opponent's flying sword. Hidden Fragrance, Big Dipper, and Huayu. Except for the still hidden Ju City, all of Lu Xiaoyi's flying swords came out together. With Hidden Fragrance as the main and Big Dipper as the supplement, they intercepted the incoming flying swords. Those flying swords looked like flying swords, but in fact, they were more like sword chi. As soon as he used this defensive method, Light immediately understood the number of flying swords. There were 2 main swords with sword spirits, and 2 supplementary swords that did not even have a complete sword formation. This was in line with the progress of his 40 years of swordsmanship. 4 flying swords, 2 living swords, 2 nurturing swords. But he still could not ignore the possibility of a 3rd flying sword with sword spirit. Lu Xiaoyi had a hard time blocking. Hidden Fragrance was a flying sword that was flexible, but its power was much weaker than the 4 Seasons, not to mention the Jews city that focused on strength. The other Big Dipper and Huayu could only be said to have little effect. They were unformed flying swords with only 5 layers. Often, after blocking 1 or 2 attacks, they would be on the verge of collapse and need to be recharged. He had no choice but to rely on his escape method to dodge, so he was obviously in a difficult situation. This sudden change made the spectating swordsman's heart skip a beat. This was the closest Xuanyuan's outer swords had come to a turnaround in tens of thousands of years. It was hard to imagine that there would not be a second time. There were many inner swords experts, and now was the best time. The most powerful brilliant light had been upgraded to Jin Dan. For the time being, there was only light supporting the outer swords. In another 50 years, the outer swords would definitely not have another cigarette but it would be normal for the inner swords to have a few brilliant lights. Although they also knew that eldest senior brother had already reached this step, but people were always greedy. Since he had already reached this step, why not take another step forward? But the battle situation did not change according to their will. The inner swords of light had already begun to gain the upper hand. For the inner swords, once they grasped the initiative, it would be extremely difficult to turn the tables. Eldest senior brother, after all, was still the eldest senior brother of the first 3 axes. Chapter 393. Light did indeed have the upper hand, but he felt that this kind of advantage made him feel uncomfortable. It was not as satisfying as it was in previous battles. The problem was with the 4 Seasons sword. Because it was constantly changing between light and heavy attacks, Light's defense was also changing between light and heavy. When the 4 Seasons sword attacked lightly, he could focus on attacking Lu Xiaoyi. When the 4 Seasons sword attacked heavily, he had no choice but to spend a lot of energy on defense, so the strength of his attacks on his opponent would be reduced. In this kind of situation, he could only watch helplessly as he lost many opportunities. He could not increase his strength to take down his opponent in one fell swoop. He was very clear about the power of the flying sword entangling him. It required a lot of effort, so he had to deal with it carefully. What disgusted him the most was that the flying sword not only changed in strength, but also in spirit. At his position, there was no one in the same realm who could match his spirit power, at least in the inner sword. However, the flying sword's spirit attack had never stopped. It was not enough to put him in a difficult situation, but it could more or less affect his performance. He was very suspicious. This was a sword spirit that knew how to attack with spirit power, but how could such a sword spirit be so powerful in both speed and strength? He could not figure it out no matter how he thought about it. Of course, he did not expect that there were 2 sword spirits in the 4 Seasons sword. One was the sword spirit, and the other was the parasite spirit. In the battle, they each did their own work. The 4 Seasons were responsible for pure attacks, and the parasite spirit was responsible for spirit harassment. After 10 years of cooperation, the 2 sword spirits could be considered to have each performed their own duties, complementing each other. With the 4 Seasons sword, it was very difficult for him to use his full attack power, even if the outer sword was always on the verge of collapse. The battlefield was divided into 2 centers. With light as the center, a string of flying swords surrounded 4 Seasons and attacked. On Lu Xiaoyi's center, Hidden Fragrance led 7 Star and Huayu to meet force with the flying swords. The two centers were closely linked, and any change in one would trigger a chain reaction in the other. Sword light crisscrossed, and light and shadow crisscrossed. Without the support of powerful spiritual power, it was impossible to maintain this situation. In this regard, at least Lu Xiaoyi was not inferior to light, who had dominated for decades. To be strong, there must be a reason behind it. In the eyes of the other cultivators, this external sword eldest senior brother was basically sitting firmly in his position as the two bearers. The others did not have the ability to compete with light on both offense and defense. Techniques had already lost their meaning in this world. The so-called drawing of a sword flower, grasping the sword's momentum, using feints, and so on, the mortal world's martial arts techniques did not exist in the world of cultivation. Every strike was aimed at a vital point, and every sword strike was done with all its might. The rhythm was getting faster and faster, and this was light gradually exerting its power. He didn't want to get close. Although close combat was his strength, who knew if it was his opponent's strength as well? In the end, the dignified inner sword was forced to use the sword in hand to determine victory. This was a blasphemy to the sword pill. The battle between the inner and outer swords should be a sword pellet against a flying sword and nothing else. What he wanted to do was to explode with the maximum sword light in a fair and square manner, and defeat his opponent in a direct confrontation. Light knew that in terms of exploding sword frequencies, he was inferior to his senior brother Light Illumination. Although his highest sword frequency was about the same as Light Illumination's explosiveness was abrupt and had a large range. He could suddenly increase from 10 sword strikes in a breath to the limit of 30 sword strikes in a breath. Then, he would slow down, explode, and change the rhythm back and forth a few times. No matter how strong the opponent was, they would bow down to this sudden change in rhythm. But he couldn't do it. This kind of abnormal explosiveness would cause his sea of consciousness to explode. He could only slowly increase the number of sword strikes step by step. In the end, he could explode to the limit of 27 sword strikes in a breath, and 8 sword strikes in a breath. But when it really reached this state, which ordinary person could withstand it? The sword whistled fiercely in the sky, and the sound of the air splitting was ear-piercing. Because the frequency of the sword strikes was too high, the flying swords almost formed a line, and became a sword whip. This kind of strange scene was what almost every inner sword cultivator dreamed of. And only at this kind of time, with such an opponent, could they feast their eyes. Was this the final struggle? Seeing eldest Shixiang struggling under the sword whip, the outer swords watching the battle felt their hearts turn cold. Many of them had fought with the inner swords before. No matter if it was on the sword branch platform or in private, in most cases, they had lost to such a rain of swords. This wasn't their fault. This was the fault of the flying swords. The corporeal sword could never compare to the illusory sword in terms of explosiveness. This was Tao, and could not be changed. Even if their eldest senior brother had increased the power of the corporeal sword to an unimaginable level, when it couldn't kill in one strike, it would still fall into the awkward situation of comparing sword frequency and quantity. It would become more and more unbearable. Lu Xiaoyi couldn't hold on any longer. The 4 seasons had already done their best. For the time being, he couldn't increase the disturbance of the 4 seasons to light. This was already their limit. They had helped him share a great deal of the pressure. A hole had appeared in his defensive flying swords. Hidden Fragrance, who was not the main flying sword, was carrying 2 crooked swords. It was becoming more and more difficult for him to defend. Sword light constantly leaked out of his defense, causing him to be in a mess. He couldn't continue like this. If he continued to persist, if he wasn't careful, he would hand over the victory. When he used his trump card, it had always been used with a purpose. Every time he used it, it would be a miracle. However, the opponent this time was too strong. They were directly suppressing him, making it impossible for his crooked methods to be used. Now, He had no choice but to use his trump card to save the situation. There was no other way. The sword box shook and Ju City flew out. The Big Dipper rain entered the box and the situation immediately changed. Ju City was also his main flying sword. The time it took to refine it wasn't much shorter than the Four Seasons. It was even more powerful than the other swords. Once it came out, the passive situation immediately stabilized. It cooperated with Hidden Fragrance and firmly blocked the flying swords outside. Under the attacks of the sword whips, it didn't move. When Ju City came out, the reactions of the spectators were all different. In the eyes of the external sword Taoist master and Jean Dan, this was definitely not a coincidence. There was a method to cultivate a sword spirit, and the truth behind it made people yearn for it. In the large crowd of spectators, the external swords let out heaven-shaking cheers. Eldest senior brother was still hiding something. He really was able to keep his composure. Who knew if he still had something else? It was hard to say. However, among the participating swordsmen, the majority of them had already determined the direction of victory and defeat. Cigarette but was in danger. They had been through life and death situations for a long time and had their own unique vision. When a cultivator passively took out his trump card to strengthen his defense, it already indicated his limit. What was Senior Brother Light's trump card? No idea. How much more explosive could the sword frequency be? No idea. The external sword eldest senior brother had no choice but to reveal his third flying sword. No one would think that he had a fourth. If that was the case, he could throw out 8 or 10 flying swords at once. Not to mention Senior Brother Light, even Senior Brother Light Glory wouldn't be able to withstand it. His potential had been exhausted. Defeat was only a matter of time. Chapter 394. Lu Xiaoyi's Ju Qing immediately stabilized the situation, but Guang Ming's sword frequency was still rising. More than 20 swords in one breath, there was still no sign of stopping. Lu Xiaoyi didn't have a good way to deal with this for the time being. He couldn't escape. Although his escape technique was outstanding, and he had the power of the stars, he still couldn't escape perfectly with Guang Ming's 100 years of deep foundation. He was stuck, he couldn't pull away, nor could he close the distance. Escape technique was a direction that consumed a lot of time. 100 years of time difference wasn't that easy to close. Although his starlight guidance was very high level, Guang Ming's inner sword escape technique wasn't any worse than his. This kind of person who controlled the inner sword for a living would definitely choose the best path for his main skill. It was clear that Guang Ming wanted to use the flying swords to resolve the battle between the inner and outer swords. It was for the sake of being upright. Guang Ming was testing his limits. He was also waiting for Guang Ming's limits. He didn't believe that even if you were a crooked machine gun, could it be that you could turn into a Gatling gun? There was always a limit. Shooting like this, wasn't he afraid of emptying his body? In a few breaths, Guang Ming's sword frequency had already reached the level of 27 or 8 swords per breath. With this kind of intensity, when the Four Seasons were at 20% weak, the majority of the pressure came to Lu Xiaoyi's side. Ju Qing and Hidden Fragrance's side had to endure 23 or 4 swords. Lu Xiaoyi's defense began to show holes again. Fortunately, these holes didn't last forever. When the Four Seasons returned to 20% strong, the pressure would return to 20 swords. Intuitively, the two knew that it was time to see the results. Guang Ming couldn't maintain this kind of high frequency of attacks, while Lu Xiaoyi was limited by his cultivation. Controlling 3 flying swords at the same time was a heavy burden on his mana. For people at their level, the changes in their moves were meaningless. Instead, it would waste precious time. What they were truly fighting was power. But before they fought, the two used a supplementary skill at the same time. Guang Ming used the inner sword secret technique Drawn Sword Prison, while Lu Xiaoyi used the outer sword secret technique Fixed Star. Both of them had the same idea, which was to compare their inner and outer swords at the swordsman's most proficient mid-range. There was no conspiracy, no trickery, and it was a direct confrontation. Immediately after, at the most crucial moment of the battle, Light used another force that he had hidden for a long time, the goat horn force. It didn't sound like anything new, but there were only a handful of people in the inner sword group who could truly comprehend the goat horn force to a profound level. It was far from something Lu Xiaoyi's goat horn force could compare to. Light was the true big goat horn, while he was the little goat horn. He lacked time and the divine essence of countless sword strikes. In terms of offense and defense, he would use the goat horn stance to attack from 3,000 feet away, and use the bloody battle stance to defend within 100 feet. He would be able to accurately differentiate between the attacks and not be confused in the crazy burst of close to 30 swords every second. Just based on this point alone, none of the inner sword elites could do it. Once the sword momentum was unleashed, the inner swordsmen gasped in amazement. They knew that the sword battle was about to end. Almost at the same time, Lu Xiaoyi no longer relied on his goat horn force. Instead, he added his most proficient, the star's force that he had comprehended the most. At Light's side, the four seasons, under the powerful support of the star's force, began to advance from 100 feet away to 150 feet away. They didn't stop and became fiercer and fiercer. They were getting closer and closer. But Light didn't care about the strong attacks of the four seasons. He continued to focus on his opponent's body, because he believed in his bloody battle stance. The closer his opponent's flying swords were, the more powerful the bloody battle stance would be. At Lu Xiaoyi's side, the ferocious flying swords, under the support of Light's goat horn force to the point of perfection, were also closing in. Even if Lu Xiaoyi used his two swords to resist and the star's force, he couldn't completely withstand the pressure. His defensive circle had also shrunk to 150 feet. The key to victory or defeat seemed to be who was the first to stab the opponent. This change was beyond the expectations of the spectators. Even the Jin Dan couldn't accurately determine who would have the last laugh. Light had a chance. Cigarette but also had a chance. Originally, they thought that victory was already decided, but now, it had become a battle between both sides. They had to lick it. They couldn't even stop. At this moment, the external swords finally knew how strong their new senior was. At least now, he was on the same level as Light, who was ranked 4th in the Foundation establishment list. He wasn't inferior in the slightest. Even Light couldn't accurately determine whether his flying swords would break through first, or the opponent's four seasons would arrive first. He couldn't tolerate any accidents. He needed to win to his heart's content. He still had a trick up his sleeve, which was set up before the battle. Silent force. He had been suppressed for too long. Now, he finally grasped the best opportunity. If he didn't die in silence, he would explode in silence. This was the true meaning of silent force. Once the power of silent force was unleashed, Lu Xiaoyi couldn't hold on any longer. The four seasons stopped advancing, while Zhu Qing and Hidden Fragrance retreated. In a flash, Light's flying swords had already reached a range of 300 feet. Seeing that the outcome was about to be decided, the crowd of cultivators below let out a sigh. Lu Xiaoyi turned a deaf ear to them. He indeed didn't have any force, but that didn't mean he had no other way. In his short 40 years of cultivation, he hadn't been in contact with the category of force for a long time, only around 20 years. The first force he comprehended was the force of stars. Because of his natural affinity with stars, his progress in the force of stars was very fast. As for the force of sheep's horn, he had only comprehended it for 10 years and was far from mature. Needless to say, the force of might was the type that was sharpened at the last minute. Overall, Lu Xiaoyi's attainments in force were far inferior to Light's. This was a problem of accumulation over time. It wasn't something that could be solved with a flash of inspiration. The only thing he could barely contend with was the force of stars, but it wasn't as professional as Light's three forces. Attacking was attacking, defending was defending, and exploding was exploding. He was already at his wits' end in terms of force, but he had his own crooked method, force removal. This was a good thing that body cultivator Cui Shi had exchanged with him. He had never stopped studying it, but the more he studied it, the more profound it became. A lot of force removal required him to master this force and understand it before he could remove it. This really made people speechless. He finally understood why this cunning Shi would use this kind of secret technique to exchange for force removal. It was completely meaningless. There were countless forces in the cultivation world. Could it be that he had to understand every one of them before he could remove them? Who could do it? It's just a flower in the water, I'm just messing with you. But there were also secret techniques that could be used. For example, force removal. It meant that he could take the initiative to remove his force and conveniently remove his opponent's force as well. If his force was greater than or equal to his opponent in the battle, then he would have achieved the goal of force removal. Of course, his force would also be gone. But Lu Xiaoyi's battle prowess didn't completely rely on force. He really relied on the sword's spirit. This was the reason why he was unique. Therefore, without any hesitation, he cleanly removed all three of his powers. Chapter 395. Lu Xiaoyi had removed his own force, and as a result, his star force, goat horn force, and majestic force were all wiped out. Moreover, Guangming's bloody battle force, goat horn force, and silent force were also wiped out. Erasing power had some kind of mysterious restriction. It couldn't be used again for a certain period of time. Therefore, the battle between the two became a battle of light. But there was one thing, the effects of power on both sides were different. No matter how much Light urged his swords, the erased flying swords were unable to advance any further under the combined defense of Jiu's city and hidden fragrance. Lu Xiaoyi was finally able to defend the last 300 feet in front of him. On the other side, the four seasons began to rush forward. Lu Xiaoyi's erasing power seemed to have been delayed by Light's silence power by a breath. This kind of delay allowed the opponent's flying swords to break through the last 300 feet. This wasn't a mistake, it was intentional. The reason why it was late was because he was waiting for the four seasons to switch from their weak state to their strong state. There were countless changes in between, but in reality, it had only been a few breaths of time since the two sides had locked onto each other. In the eyes of the bystanders, what they saw was the intertwining of light and shadow. But in reality, the changes in the momentum behind the scenes were the key to deciding the outcome of the battle. This was not something that everyone could see. The bystanders only felt the west wind tighten and the east wind become stronger. Even now, they couldn't be sure who would have the last laugh. When the sword's power was no longer there, the last several hundred feet were covered in the blink of an eye. Light had no choice but to focus all of his power on defending against the four seasons. Of course, he could defend against them. As long as he used all of his flying swords to stop the four seasons, the result would be Jiu's city and hidden fragrance closing in. At this point, the battle had returned from two focal points to one. The intense attack and defense were about 200-300 feet from Light's side. The sword Light was still like a chain, blocking the four seasons, Jiu's city, hidden fragrance. They formed a final stalemate at 200 feet, waiting for the final change. 200 feet. Even someone as agile as the swordsman would find it difficult to escape the flying sword's pursuit at this distance. This was an attack and defense that no one could give up. There wasn't even a chance to change moves. Lu Xiaoyi had changed. All of their previous efforts had been wasted. As long as Light could catch his breath, it would be his doomsday. His problem was his Fa. How long could he maintain this level of attack? The moment Light changed, he would be pierced by the flying swords that were close by. He didn't have the space to change his mind. His problem was overclocking. How long could he maintain nearly 30 swords in a breath? Humans were not machines. It was impossible for them to maintain such a high level of explosive power. But light didn't retreat. Even if his brain matter exploded, he had to persevere until the last moment. Because he was the last guardian of the glory of the Xianyuan Nijian lineage. If he fell, there would be no one. This was only in an instant. The host, Taoist Master Inner Sword, sighed and waved his hand. The two people who were stuck together were suddenly separated by an irresistible force, no matter how unwilling they were. The Sword of Swords Soft the Hands sect was of the of Soft his of the heart of hands of the of S of swords of the sect. Sage nascent soul Taoist master judged that there were no technical problems in all of this. The battle space withdrew. Over 10,000 cultivators looked up at the Prime Minister, waiting for his judgment. Taoist Master Inner Sword's clear voice spread throughout the snowy plains. End. Outer Sword smoke but wins. Inner Sword Guangming has lost. The entire snowfield froze for a moment. Then, a huge wave of cheers swept through the entire hidden sword peak. Some of the old external sword cultivators had tears in their eyes. They had been pressed against the ground by the internal sword all their lives. They had never thought that there would be a day where they could hold their heads high like today. They couldn't change history, but they witnessed it. The inner sword participants looked desolate. Most of them had accepted it, but there were also those who were unconvinced. Yan Dao twisted his voice and said, Grand Master, I have doubts about the verdict. At the very least, this is a 2-point game. How can it be that my inner sword will lose? The immortal host did not want to answer, but when he saw the expressions of the crowd, he knew that not answering might cause unnecessary dissatisfaction. Thus, he gave a rare explanation. Continue. The cigarette but would damage his dantian and cripple his cultivation. The light would destroy the Niwen, and it would be no different from an idiot. Tell me, who won and who lost? This is Xuanyuan's competition. No matter who wins, it's Xuanyuan's victory. Don't let others say that our inner sword sect is arrogant and can't afford to lose. No one doubted it because what the immortal said was the truth. Lu Xiaoyi could still cultivate, but there was no hope for him to reach the upper realm. However, if his brain exploded into paste, could he still be a cultivator? Immortal Outer Sword flew over and waved his hand. Senior brother is fair and selfless. I really admire you. He actually understood that even though the immortal host said that both sides were tied, he could not say anything. It was reasonable. Immortal Inner Sword smiled. Junior brother is wrong. This is not fair, this is a win-win. If Outer Sword wins, it can sweep away the decadence of Outer Sword for tens of thousands of years. If Inner Sword loses, it can wake up the arrogance of Inner Sword for tens of thousands of years. If the sword is not sharpened, people will not advance. To be honest, my Inner Sword sect has been waiting for this day for tens of thousands of years. How can I let go of such an opportunity? Just now, the immortals of Wenguang Peak's Thunder Palace reminded me that they wanted me to help you win. I refused. Fortunately, you external swordsmen have obtained victory with your own strength, and you deserve it. Junior brother, congratulations. The Outer Sword has finally produced a talent. Immortal Outer Sword smiled knowingly. It is Xianyuan that produces talents in large numbers. The Inner Sword and Outer Sword are called Xianyuan in the outside world. This time, when Lu Xiaoyi returned to the Outer Sword sect's cultivators, they no longer nodded in greeting. Instead, they consciously called him eldest senior brother. There was no exception. 6 battles, 6 Inner Sword sect cultivators. From the hundreds of Five-Ring Foundation establishment cultivators, he had chosen all the way to 4th place. There was not the slightest bit of exaggeration. It was all based on the ability of the sword. To be honest, with their abilities, it was a matter of one sword. There was no doubt. Henceforth, although only half of the 20 years had passed, his position as eldest senior brother was already set. At least among the Outer Sword sect, there was no one else who dared to challenge him. Life's fate was different from the past. Who would be able to reach his current position as a mere 999th place? From the looks of it, the person in charge of the rankings was truly unfathomable. Under the circumstances where he had not fought with anyone on the rankings, he had been pulled into the rankings. Furthermore, he had been pulled into the high position of 11th place. Who knew what they had discovered? Seeing his second senior brother and third senior brother surrounding him, he knew that he had to say something. A white face covers 100 ugliness. Fox odor destroys everything. My cultivation is really not good. It was almost emptied out by others. Therefore, I may have to go into seclusion for a period of time and work hard on my cultivation. Otherwise, I'm afraid the inner sword sex troubles will not be resolved in a short period of time. Since I've turned over, I should at least have a good night's sleep. I can't be beaten back to my original state right after turning over. There are some matters that I'll have to trouble you senior brothers. I won't be participating for the time being. I'm ashamed of myself for being lazy. The outer sword sex leaders nodded. Eldest senior brother was right. The inner sword sex cultivators were definitely unwilling to accept this defeat. In the future they would find other ways to challenge him. Eldest senior brother's abilities were top-notch in all other aspects, but his cultivation was a little awkward. He needed to rest for a period of time to raise his cultivation realm. Chapter 396. If Lu Xiaoyi wanted to hide and relax, he would have to see if the higher-ups agreed or not. At least in the Sword Chi Soaring Pavilion, a Foundation establishment disciple actually managed to give birth to 3 sword spirits within 40 years of entering the sect. This kind of thing could greatly affect the future of the external sword, so they could not help but be concerned. The Jin Dan was already unable to deal with this matter, so in a situation where there was no result, they could only leave it to the higher-ups to make a decision. This was an expanded meeting, and 2 Jin Dan were fortunate enough to attend. Gu Gang represented the various halls under the Soaring Pavilion, and they were also the ones most familiar with cigarette butts. Gu Dong represented the Jin Dan directly under the Soaring Pavilion. In addition, there were several perfected Yuanying masters and a perfected lord of the Soaring Pavilion. They basically represented the upper echelons of the external sword. For a mere Foundation establishment disciple, this lineup was a little too big, but if one considered the influence of sword spirits on the external sword, it was not excessive at all. A perfected master raised his head. Speak, what are the opinions of those below? You are all familiar with this person, so you have the right to voice your opinions. As the Jin Dan directly under the Soaring Pavilion, Gu Dong was the first to speak. There is no need to talk about this person's strength, and there should be no problem with his loyalty. His origins are a little unclear. Although we know that he is a foreign cultivator, his past in his own domain is still a mystery. The perfected lord of the pavilion interrupted him. Regarding loyalty and origins, let's not discuss these. Due to some special reasons, when this person first entered the sect, his origins were already verified. He was jointly examined by the Soaring Pavilion's Pavilion Lord and the 3 Thunder Palace Lords, so there should be no doubts. Everyone was shocked. What kind of person was this? When he first entered the sect, he needed 4 perfected lords to personally examine him? Normally, new disciples would at most take a look at the Jin Dan. Even perfected Yuanying masters were too lazy to interfere, let alone perfected lords. Perhaps this was the reason why this person was so different. However, Gu Dong was a straightforward person. Even the words of a perfected lord could not stop him from voicing his opinion. Grandmaster is right. I am not suspecting him, but judging that his origins might be related to having so many sword spirits? 3 sword spirits in 40 years, this is not a coincidence, it must be some kind of necessity. I believe that all the martial uncles and grandmasters present here understand the significance of this better than I do. It will have a profound impact on my external sword lineage. After the sword battle, I asked him about it, but he said that he didn't know either. He just said that there was a high probability of creating a new sword spirit by killing a person. He has indeed killed many people since he entered the sect. They were all the elite disciples of the Supreme and Three Pure Ones. Therefore, I don't doubt the truth of what he said. However, I still think that he must have some secrets that he hasn't told us yet. Otherwise, there is no way to explain this strange phenomenon. In my external sword lineage, I have killed many people, even more than him. Why can't they give birth to a sword spirit? I, Xianyuan, have always protected the privacy of my disciples. This is also the rule of the cultivation world. However, there are differences in the size of the matter and the importance of the matter. When facing the future of the entire branch of the external sword, personal privacy should not be an obstacle. I think he must tell us his secret. Even if the sect has to take some special measures, we will not hesitate. Gu Gang couldn't help but say, "This disciple also has something to say." Speak. Gu Gang was a little impulsive. He didn't agree with Gu Dong's opinion. This old man was stubborn and always did good things wrong. He was famous in the external sword lineage for being smelly and stubborn. However, he didn't know it and thought that he was doing it for Xianyuan. This disciple thinks that rules are rules. If you want to find a reason, then what rules can't be broken? Everyone has secrets. This is the common characteristic of cultivators. Grandmaster, you have it. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to become a perfected lord. Martial uncles also have it. Otherwise, why are you able to travel the void? I also have secrets. Senior brother Gu Dong, you don't? Gu Dong straightened his neck. I don't have any secrets to the sect. Gu Gang sneered. Therefore, you can only die of old age on Jin Dan. Even the heavenly Tao looks down on a person who doesn't even have a secret. The perfected master frowned. Speak properly. No personal attacks. Swordsman meetings were very simple and crude. It wasn't rare for them to use words to fight. This was also one of the reasons why Dharma cultivators looked down on them. However, swordsmen persisted. Arguments often meant the truth. If everyone kept silent, this Tao tradition would lose its important vitality. Among the great cultivators of our Xianyuan ancestors, there were countless ability users who didn't belong to the Xianyuan Tao tradition. If we asked them to hand over their secrets for the benefit of Xuanyuan's future development, then would they still stay in Xianyuan? Whether it was the external sword Boa Tower or the inner sword Fanlu Tower, they all had the insights left behind by various swordsmen. There were countless inheritances and all kinds of strange things with different origins. However, there was one thing in common. They were all voluntarily donated by our Xianyuan swordsmen. None of them were forced by the sect. Xianyuan had been passed down for tens of thousands of years. When had it ever relied on a divine art or secret technique? It was a kind of spirit. If they felt that it was beneficial to the sect, then so be it. This was voluntary and not an obligation. If they felt that it was inappropriate, whether it was because they had made a promise to others or because of the cause and effect of the incident, or because they themselves were ambiguous. If they didn't donate, then so be it. Would Xianyuan not be Xianyuan because of this? Would they be defeated? I've interacted with Cigarette but a lot since he entered the sect. If he says that he doesn't know, then he doesn't know. In the cultivation world, there are some mysteries and some inexplicable. How many people have figured it out after tens of thousands of years? I think that we don't have to care about this. If we investigate too much, it will chill the hearts of the disciples. After the two finished speaking, they fell silent. Xianyuan encouraged everyone to speak up, but they couldn't be long-winded in front of their masters. Since they had already expressed the opinions of the two factions, the rest would be left to the seniors and masters. Everyone looked at the perfected master of the pavilion. He was the one who made the decision. In the cultivation world, one's realm represented one's insight. That couldn't be wrong. The perfected master didn't hesitate. Swordsmen had always done things decisively and rarely procrastinated. So, regarding the matter of the spirit on this child's sword, I will take charge of it. You don't have to interfere. Just treat it as if nothing happened. I only have one thing to say. The reason why Xianyuan is strong is because we know that the only one who can defeat Xianyuan is Xianyuan ourselves. Therefore, any plan against our own people, even if it's under the guise of the sect, must be carefully considered. You can't be rash. The perfected master meant that everything related to this child would be left to him. The other Yuanying Jin Dan couldn't interfere. This was also a method. When the perfected master dealt with this kind of matter, he always had a way to do it without alerting the person involved. But from the meaning of his words, he still leaned towards Gu Gang's opinion. Only at their level would they know what tradition meant to a sect. It was something that must be protected. Seeing the two Jin Dan leave, the perfected master explained to the Yuanying below. If there's really a way for everyone to obtain a sword spirit, do you think it's a blessing or a curse for Xianyuan? With tens of thousands of strong outer swordsmen comparable to the inner sword, it's only a matter of time before he can defeat the five-ring swordsman and dominate the universe. Blessings can't be enjoyed to the fullest, power can't be used to the fullest. After the heavenly Tao gives you a sweet date, it will definitely be followed by a big stick. Chapter 397. External Sword Monarch Zhou Jiong waited for his disciples to leave before feeling troubled. Actually, no one was more eager than him for sword spirits to be popularized among ordinary external swords. With thousands of years of life, as a cultivator standing at the top of the pyramid, the more he experienced, the more he understood the pain and helplessness of being an external sword. Everyone had their own pride, even more so for cultivators. Then, what would a monarch's pride be like? No one was born to be a supporting character, or a supporting character. And he had been doing this for thousands of years. When he was in Foundation establishment, he was the supporting character of the internal sword. When he was in Jin Dan, he was the supporting character of the internal sword Jin Dan. Now that he was a monarch, he was still the supporting character of the internal sword monarch. It wasn't just his head that was green, his heart was green. Even if not everyone had the chance to give birth to a sword spirit, some of them would be good. Even a small portion would be good. A sword spirit was too important to an external sword. It would help them understand the essence of the sword and avoid detours. They wouldn't need to waste too much time on useless skills when they were in Foundation establishment Jin Dan. According to his understanding, if one could give birth to a sword spirit at Foundation establishment, then more than half of the current system of external swords would be useless and wouldn't need to be learned. This would save at least a few hundred years of time for low and middle level cultivators, the most precious few hundred years of time in the initial stage of cultivation. A few hundred years for a Foundation establishment Jin Dan and a few hundred years for a monarch were completely different. The former was everything, while the latter was just a dispensable part. Therefore, although what he said was very traditional and righteous, he still wanted to know the secret in his heart. However, this kind of thing couldn't be done by those careless disciples under him. It was very easy to leave behind some loose ends, and if they couldn't deal with it cleanly, it would also cause harm to the little guy. He still wanted to do it himself. With the power of a monarch, he wouldn't disturb the little guy while secretly achieving his goal. But before that, he still wanted to ask for the opinion of a good friend. This little fellow was a little unusual. When he first entered the sect, he was questioned by the four true monarchs. At that time, the Soaring Heaven Pavilion Master, Gong Yao, was also present. Unfortunately, this fellow had ulcers on his butt and could not sit still. Since then, he had been gone for dozens of years without any news. According to the habits of cultivators at their level, he could not be counted on to return in the next few hundred years. Gong Yao had once mentioned this little guy when they were chatting, but he didn't mention it in detail. His fart was incomplete, which was why he was now in a dilemma. However, it didn't matter. He had friends in the Thunder Palace too. Vice Palace Master Gong Qing shared similar interests with him, and had a good relationship with him. He was also one of the 4 true monarchs present at the time. There was no need for him to hide. He couldn't reveal his true colors in front of the younger disciples, but what couldn't he say in front of the true monarchs of the same generation? He was doing this for the sect, not for his own personal matters. He was not worried about the sword spirit now. With a sweep of his divine sense, he drifted to Wenguang Feng, but he couldn't find him. He then expanded his divine sense to cover the entire dome, but he still couldn't find him. Where did this person go? Why didn't he go to the void of the universe? Since his divine sense couldn't find him, he could only send out a sword talisman. He immediately received a reply. "What's the matter, senior brother? Why are you in such a hurry? There's no purple clear, and there aren't many jade clear either. If there's nothing important, just leave a message." Shou Jing scolded jokingly. "I've only borrowed resources from you once, and it was an old matter from when I was in Foundation establishment. It's really hard for you to remember it for thousands of years. I have something that senior brother Gong Yao didn't mention in detail before he left. I'd like to ask about the specific situation back then." He briefly explained the changes in the sword battle inside and outside, including his desire to find out the true origins of this little guy's sword spirit. Gong Qing laughed. "What's the use of you finding out? Back in the Thunder Palace, it was junior brother Le Feng, who was skilled in this aspect, who made a move. In the end, it was all for naught. What can you find out with that two-headed mental power of yours? However, that little guy's entry into the sect has nothing to do with us, but..." The more Zhou Jiong listened, the more curious he became. This little guy actually had such a miraculous ability? He'd only just entered the sect, but he could make the sword orb automatically avoid him when he tried to capture it. It was truly inconceivable. The Thunder Palace's ability to keep secrets was also impressive. He actually hadn't heard any news about this matter. However, from this point of view, that little guy was very likely telling the truth. He was able to give birth to a sword spirit not through some kind of martial arts, but because he possessed a mysterious ability in the unseen world. Even he himself couldn't figure it out. This kind of individual ability wasn't something that could be learned or imparted. It was a gift from the heavens, so he extinguished the idea of promoting it in the external sword world. However, this little guy was becoming more and more interesting to him. Gong Qing occasionally heard him mention old matters and was also somewhat curious. To be honest, the scene when he was choosing the sword orb was indeed strange. As time passed, he had somewhat forgotten about it, but now, "Senior brother, it's definitely useless for a spirit like you to probe. I have a good idea here. It just so happens that Lu Zhu has returned to the dome during this period of time. We're also discussing Dao at Crow Peak. Why don't you bring your problem over? With Lu Zhu taking action, what can't be solved?" Zhou Jiong's eyes lit up. Lu Zhu, not Lu Zhu. He was currently Xuan Yuan's strongest backer, his thigh. Born from the inner sword, he was known as the Demon Sword Lord in the universe. He was a half-immortal figure, and he didn't walk the path of the blight state. He was a true almighty who had achieved Dao by severing corpses. Lu Zhu rarely returned. In 10,000 years, he had only returned twice or thrice. The time he stayed was also very short. However, this time was more coincidental. He had returned to the dome and lived for a few years. No one knew when he would leave. He often discussed Dao at Crow Peak with a group of perfected sovereigns. He also frequently went there himself. If this matter was mentioned to Lu Zhu, he could just treat it as a small episode in the dome. There was nothing inappropriate about it. This kind of small matter could be calculated by Lu Zhu. Just as he was about to move, he suddenly stopped. He suddenly realized that this bastard Gong Qing wasn't giving him a good idea. He was clearly taking the opportunity to find out why the sword orb was hiding from the little guy. Now, he was using him as a front. He was careless in making friends. However, he really didn't have any better ideas at the moment. This was the most open and honorable move that wouldn't fall into the hands of others. Shaking his head, his figure flashed and disappeared without a trace. Recently, Crow Peak was often shrouded in heavy fog. The middle and low-level disciples didn't know what was going on. Only perfected Yuanying and other great cultivators knew the truth. This was Lu Zu's preaching. It was a barrier set up to prevent low-level disciples from entering rashly. Lu Zu was a serious person. He believed in teaching one level at a time. To him, if he imparted widely, it would be a formality with no meaning. Jin Dan taught foundation establishment, while Yuanying taught Jin Dan. This was the right principle. When it came to him, he would usually preach Tao to the perfected sovereigns when he was free. Occasionally, he would extend it to Yuanying. It was very rare. For example, this time, it was a Dharma assembly specially for perfected sovereigns. Yuanying wasn't present. Almost all the perfected sovereigns of the inner and outer sword were present. Lu Zu's preaching was extremely rare. He wouldn't come back more than 3 times in 10,000 years. To many of them, this might be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. It would be strange if they didn't cherish it. You're tuning into the Phoenix Nights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.